The voices were unfamiliar, the language was foreign, but for some reason he understood every word. A red-haired, strapping fellow in a leather apron stood over him, grinning so widely that a chipped tooth was visible. Gunter, that name just popped into his head, just like the other name, Park Min Jae, except that Park Min Jae had died 20 minutes ago on a highway in Seoul, and the one lying face down on the anvil was a skinny apprentice in a blacksmith shop that smelled of iron and burnt lard. The hands were unfamiliar, thin, calloused, but not from a hammer, from tongs. Min Jae knew those calluses. He had exactly the same ones himself. This guy worked with small stuff, and he was beaten for it. Gunter said that if the scoundrel didn't forge at least one decent blade by evening, the master would throw him out onto the street. The 3 other apprentices behind him cackled. One kicked something across the floor. Min Jae lowered his gaze. On the stone slabs lay an unfinished iron trinket, crooked, with a tentative pattern. Rough work, childish. But someone had tried. Someone in that body had sat there night after night, trying to make something beautiful out of a piece of junk iron, and for that he was beaten. Min Jae slowly stood up. His knees were shaking. His body felt weightless. He looked at his new palms. He turned them over. Long fingers, slender wrists, hands made for jewelry. Something clicked inside him. Quietly, almost silently, like the lock on a tool case. Blades. They want him to forge blades. No, he won't make blades, but rings. He knows how to make rings, and by the looks of it, no one else here knows how. Gunter shouted something after him. Min Jae couldn't hear him anymore. He walked toward the far corner of the workshop. There stood a small crucible, abandoned, covered in dust. Thin pliers and scraps of wire lay nearby. Someone had once worked here with small parts, perhaps the former owner of this body, or perhaps someone before him. Min Jae sat down on a low bench and rested his hands on his knees. He closed his eyes. He needed to figure out 3 things: where he was, what he was capable of, and where to find silver here. The workshop was enormous. The ceiling was obscured by soot. 4 large forges stood in a row. 2 people were working at each one. The apprentices were forging blanks for swords and pommels. The clanging was so loud it made your teeth grind. At the far end, behind a separate anvil, the master himself was working. An old man with hands like oak roots, a beard down to his waist, an apron scorched in 10 places. Master Hammerstein. That name, too, just popped into his head. His body's memory was feeding him information in bits and pieces. The city is called Haldenburg, the capital of the kingdom of Westmar. The Hammerstein House Workshop, the oldest forge in the country. This is where blades for the Royal Guard are forged. Blacksmiths are a respected caste, but a dirty one. They make weapons for knights, but they themselves will never be their equals. There are 2 kinds of power in this world: the gift of blood, which is passed down through lineage, and the blessing of the church, which is granted by priests in exchange for money or loyalty. Everything else is considered worthless. A blacksmith may be a master of his craft, but without the gift or the blessing, he's just a common artisan. Furniture, tools. Min Jae smirked. It was pretty much the same in Seoul. Only instead of the gift of blood, there were chaebol, and instead of the church's blessing, there was a credit rating. Nothing new. He stood up and walked over to the shelves along the wall. There lay the raw materials: iron rods, bronze ingots, and copper wire. No silver. Silver was expensive. Apprentices weren't given any. Min Jae ran his finger along a coil of copper. Copper would do, too, for a first attempt. If he could even do here what he'd done in Seoul. He returned to the crucible and began sorting through the tools. The pliers were crude. The file was worn down. Not a single decent magnifying glass. Not a single jeweler's hammer. Just blacksmith's junk repurposed for fine work. Min Jae cursed quietly in Korean. Then he caught himself swearing in Korean and froze. The voice was unfamiliar, lower than his own, but the words were his. 2 worlds in one throat, a strange sensation. He shook his head and got back to work. For 3 hours, he put his tools in order. He straightened the pliers. He sharpened the file against the edge of the anvil. From a piece of leather strap, he made a makeshift polishing cloth. The work was soothing. His hands remembered the movements, even if his fingers were someone else's. By noon, Gunter came to check on him. He saw that the scoundrel was sitting in the corner, fiddling with some trifle instead of forging the blade. He grabbed him by the collar and lifted him up like a puppy. He said the master was expecting the blank by evening, that if the good-for-nothing brought his trinkets again, Gunter would personally shove his head into the forge. Min Jae looked him in the eyes, calmly, without defiance. He just looked, and in that moment, he saw something strange, something he'd never seen in his life. Not in Seoul, not anywhere else. A thin line was emanating from Gunter, pale, barely noticeable. It stretched off toward the furnace. Min Jae followed it with his eyes. The line led to one of the apprentices, a stocky guy, with a scorched ear. They were standing far apart, but the line between them was there, faint, almost invisible, but alive. Min Jae blinked. The line vanished. Gunter shook him once more and threw him to the floor. He left. Min Jae remained seated. His heart was pounding. He had seen a connection between the two men, not friendship, not enmity, something deeper, something on a level he had previously sensed, only intuitively. In Seoul, when a couple came to him for engagement rings, he always knew, right away, the moment they walked in, whether they would stay together, whether they truly loved each other, or were just playing roles. He could never explain how he knew. He just knew. Here, it became visible. Literally. He saw the lines connecting people. The day passed. Min Jae didn't forge the blade. Master Hammerstein came to see him that evening. The old man was exhausted. His eyes were red from the heat. His hands were shaking. His back was bent so far that it looked as if he were carrying an invisible anvil on his shoulders. The master looked at the empty workbench. He looked at Min Jae, and he said, "Tomorrow." If there was no blade by tomorrow, he should pack his things. Min Jae nodded. The master left. A girl hobbled after him, slender, pale, with a wooden stick in her hand instead of a cane. She walked slowly. Every step was a struggle for her. Her right leg barely bent. Liesel, the master's daughter, a childhood illness had taken her leg. Not entirely, but enough to make every step a small torture. Min Jae watched as she walked away, and he saw another line. From the master to her, bright, golden, pulsating. This line was strong, father and daughter, blood and love. And he saw something else, a dark knot on the line, right where her leg had been, like a twisted wire. Pain flowed along this connection in both directions. She was suffering, and he suffered with her. Every day. In silence. Min Jae closed his eyes, opened them. The line was still visible. This wasn't a hallucination. It was something new, something that belonged to this world. He didn't know what to call it yet. He didn't know what to do with it, but he knew one thing. He'd been making rings for couples for 20 years. He knew what a bond between two people was. He knew how it worked, how it broke, how it held, and now he could see these bonds with his own eyes. On the next day, began with a kick. Gunter again. Min Jae rolled out of the way and got to his feet before the boot came flying at him a second time. Progress. He walked over to the crucible. He wouldn't be forging a blade today, nor tomorrow. He would do what he knew how to do. He spent half the day looking for silver. He searched the entire workshop, peered into every box, every nook and cranny. There was no silver, just scraps of bronze. There was a little tin, copper, iron, nothing precious. Min Jae sat down on the floor and thought. In Seoul, he'd worked with gold and silver. Here, he had only base metals. But did that ever stop him? He remembered his first commission. He was 19, a student, no money. The client wanted a ring but could only afford copper. Min Jae made a copper ring with a design so beautiful that the client burst into tears. The material doesn't matter. What matters are your hands. What matters is knowledge. What matters is understanding the two people you're working for. He took a piece of copper wire and began to work. His fingers remembered. His new body was harder to control than his old one. His movements were imprecise, like playing the piano while wearing gloves. But the basic skills remained: bending, twisting, shaping. By evening, he made a simple copper ring, smooth, without a pattern. Just to prove to himself that he could, he slipped it onto his finger. Nothing happened. The ring was just a ring. A beautiful piece of copper on a dirty finger. Min Jae took it off and placed it on the workbench. He looked at it. Something was missing. He closed his eyes and tried to recall that feeling. Lines, connections between people. He'd seen them yesterday. Could he see them now? He opened his eyes. The workshop was empty. Everyone had left. Only the coals were smoldering in the furnace. And in the corner, on a bench, sat Liesel. She had come in quietly. She brought him a mug of water and a piece of bread. She set them down beside him. She didn't say a word. She just sat there. Min Jae looked at her, and he saw it again. The dark knot on her leg, pain, constant, aching. She had grown used to it, but getting used to it didn't mean the pain was gone. He picked up the mug, took a sip. The water was warm. It tasted of iron. He asked her name. She replied that it was Liesel. He asked what she dreamed of. She looked at him strangely. No one had ever asked her that before. She was silent for a moment. Then she said quietly that she wanted to walk without a cane. Just for one evening. Just to stroll through the market square like everyone else. Without pain, without a cane, without pitying glances. Min Jae nodded. He finished his water and went back to work. Now he knew who he was making the ring for. Day 3. Master Hammerstein arrived in the morning. He looked at the workbench. The blade was gone. The old man flushed red. He said that was it. Enough. Let the scoundrel get lost. Min Jae raised his hand and asked for one more day. Just one. The master wanted to refuse, but something in his apprentice's eyes stopped him. Maybe it was the calmness. Maybe it was a confidence he hadn't had before. The old man grumbled that it had to be done by sunset, and he tossed him a piece of silver wire. He told him to make at least a horseshoe for a cat. Useless. Min Jae caught the wire. Silver. Finally. He sat down at the forge and began to work. 8 hours. Without a break, without food. He forgot everything. About Gunter, about the threats. About the fact that he had a foreign body in a foreign world. All that remained were his fingers and the metal. He thought about the master, about his back that wouldn't straighten, about his hands that trembled, about 40 years at the anvil, about the daughter he used to carry in his arms when she was little, and whom he now couldn't lift because of his back. He thought about Liesel, about her cane, about her dream of walking without pain, about how she brought him water without asking a thing, about she just brought it. He wove all of this into the metal, not with words, with movements. Every bend of the wire carried something within it. The shape of her stride, the rhythm of his blows on the anvil, the line connecting them, that very golden, pulsating thread between father and daughter. He saw it as he worked. It burned before his eyes like a blueprint. He followed it. By nightfall, the workshop was empty. Everyone had left. Only Liesel had come back. She brought water. He didn't lose focus. She sat down on a bench and watched. Silently, he worked until dawn. When the first light filtered through the cracks in the shutters, 2 rings lay on the workbench. Small, silver, identical in shape but different in pattern. On one, a delicate engraving replicated the pattern of calluses on the blacksmith's palm. On the other, the line of the pattern ran straight, without a single flaw, like the stride of a healthy man. Min Jae picked up the rings. He looked at them. Inside each one, he sensed something. Not warmth, not magic. Something else. Readiness, like a lock, waiting for a key. He turned toward Liesel. She was sleeping on the bench, curled up in a ball. The stick lay nearby. Min Jae didn't wake her. He waited for the master. The old man arrived at dawn, as always. He saw the rings on the workbench. He grunted. He picked up one. He turned it over in his hand. The workmanship was delicate, neater than anything he'd seen from this apprentice. Min Jae handed him the second ring and said they were a pair. One for him, one for Liesel. He asked him to put both on. The master looked at him as if he were crazy. But something made him listen. Perhaps a craftsman's curiosity, maybe it was exhaustion. He woke Liesel, he slipped the ring onto her finger, he put on his own. And the world changed. Master Hammerstein stood up straight for the first time in years. The back pain that had been with him for so long it had become part of his body simply vanished. He stood upright. His hands didn't shake. He looked at his palms, then at Min Jae, then at Liesel. Liesel was standing, without her cane. She was simply standing upright on her own 2 feet. Then she took a step. One, then a second, then a third, without pain, without limping. She walked across the workshop from the forge to the anvil and back. Tears streamed down her face. She didn't wipe them away. The master sat down on the floor, heavily, not because it hurt, because his legs couldn't hold him up for another reason. He watched his daughter walking, and the apprentice he'd called a disgrace just yesterday. Min Jae explained. Briefly, without unnecessary words, he said he had taken some of her pain upon himself, and he had given the master some of her lightness. As long as the rings were on his fingers, it would work. If he took them off, the effect would wear off in an hour. The master was silent for a long time. Then he stood up. He walked right up to Min Jae. He placed his heavy hand on his shoulder and in a hoarse voice told him to get rid of it. Not to show it to anyone. If the church found out, they'd burn him before sunset. Min Jae already understood. He'd spent 3 days in this world. He'd heard the apprentices talking about the Church of the Single Flame, about priests who handed out blessings for gold, about how any power not derived from the 2 permitted sources is heresy. He realized that his rings weren't just jewelry. They were something this world had banned 200 years ago, and something people were killed for here. The master said it again. Quiet, put it away, hide it, forget it. Min Jae looked him in the eye and said nothing, but they both knew he wouldn't put it away. The next few days were strange. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Manjo still sat in his corner. He still wasn't forging blades. Gunter was still picking on him, but the master no longer pushed him around. Silently, he set aside a separate corner for him, farther away from the others. He gave him a fine tool from his own supplies. He gave him a little silver. He didn't explain anything to the apprentices. They decided the scumbag had been sucking up, or that he was the master's daughter's lover. Gunter grew even meaner. Something happened every day. One day it was an overturned crucible. Then the straps of his apron were cut. Then soot was sprinkled into his drinking water. Petty acts of malice. Senseless spite. Min Jae endured it. Not because he was patient, because he was weak. His body couldn't fight back against Gunter. Gunter was twice as broad and a head taller. One blow and Min Jae would be on the floor. Again. So he endured it, and he worked. Every evening after everyone had left, Min Jae would sit down at the furnace and practice. He made rings out of copper, out of bronze, out of scraps. Not in pairs, just rings. He trained his hands, taught his new body the old movements. His fingers became more obedient with each passing day. Liesel came every evening. She brought water, sometimes bread. She sat on a bench and watched him work. They hardly spoke, but the silence was comforting. The 14th day, Min Jae was sitting at his workbench, polishing a copper ring, when the workshop door swung open so hard that the hinges screeched. All the apprentices looked up. Standing in the doorway was a woman in armor. Her breastplate was crumpled. Her left shoulder guard was missing. There was a fresh cut on her cheek, patched with something brown. Her light hair was tied in a bun at the nape of her neck. She had gray at her temples. She was about 24 years old, but her eyes were older, much older. She stepped inside and the clanging of the workshop fell silent. Even Gunter stopped hammering. A night in a blacksmith's shop was nothing out of the ordinary. They came for weapons, but this night looked as if she had come not for a sword, but for something that had no name. Master Hammerstein came out to meet her. They spoke quietly. Min Jae couldn't hear their words, but he saw something else. Lines. Lines radiated from this woman in every direction. Dozens of them, dull, severed, like the roots of an uprooted tree. Each severed line ended in emptiness, dead connections. People who were no longer there. Min Jae counted 17 stumps before he stopped counting. This woman had lost an entire squad. The master nodded and led her to the anvil. He showed her the sword blanks. She shook her head. She didn't need a standard blade. She needed something capable of killing a creature that made steel bounce off it. The master's face darkened. He said he didn't know of any such blades. She nodded. She was already about to leave. Min Jae stood up from the bench, without thinking. He just stood up. And he said he wouldn't make her a sword, but he'd make something even better. Everyone looked at him. Gunter snorted. The apprentices exchanged glances. The master turned pale. The woman turned to face him. She looked down at him. She was a head taller than him, in armor, with a sword at her belt, and 17 dead comrades behind her. She asked who he was. Min Jae replied that he was a jeweler. She didn't understand the word. He said he made rings. She looked at his hands, thin, dirty, without the calluses from a sword. Then she looked at the master. The master closed his eyes for a second. Then he said quietly that the apprentice should give it a try. The woman's name was Rosalia von Eisenhardt, a junior captain in the Royal Guard, the heiress to an impoverished knightly house. Her brother had been killed by a void beast 3 weeks earlier. A squad of 12 men had set out for the border. 4 returned. She didn't tell him this right away. Min Jae found out bit by bit through the questions he asked. Quiet ones. Strange ones. Not the kind blacksmiths ask. He asked which hand she used to hold her sword. Her right. He asked which hand she used to eat with. Her right, too. He asked which hand she used to cover her eyes when she couldn't sleep. She fell silent. Then she said, "My left." He nodded. He asked about her brother. She didn't want to answer. He didn't press her. He just sat beside her and worked on a piece of silver. In silence. She stood by the forge. She stared at the fire. And an hour later she began to speak. Not because he asked her to, because the silence felt right, the kind of silence in which one can speak. Her brother's name was Victor. He was 2 years older. She'd spent her whole life following in his footsteps. He was better at everything. Stronger, faster, father's favorite. For 20 years, Rosalia had been proving that she was just as good. And she proved it on the very day Victor didn't return from the border. Her hair turned gray overnight, her left temple, then the right. Within a week, she was 24, but her hair was as gray as an old woman's. Min Jae listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say everything would be all right. He did what he always did. He memorized the shape of her fingers, her habit of clenching her fist before saying something important, the scar on her left wrist that she covered with a bracelet, the way she stood with her left shoulder turned slightly forward, like a shield, even without a shield. She came the next day, and the day after that. The master didn't mind. Liesel brought her water just as she had brought it to Min Jae. At first, Rosalia didn't notice the girl. Then she did. She noticed that Liesel was walking without a cane. She asked why. Liesel looked at her ring and said nothing. Rosalia looked at the ring, then at Min Jae, then back at the ring. She said nothing. Min Jae had spent 5 days working on her ring. It was more complicated than the first one. He'd made the first one for a couple he knew, a father and daughter. A simple line, strong, pure. Here the lines ran differently. This ring connected him to her, a stranger to a stranger, a jeweler to a knight. But he felt that a connection was possible. The line between them was thin, new, but it was there. He saw it every time Rosalia came to the workshop. And with each passing day, the line grew a little brighter. Not from love, from trust. She had begun to trust him. That was enough. On the 6th day, the rings were ready. 2 silver rings. Victor's initials were woven into the pattern of hers, not with his date of death, with his date of birth. Min Jae held out the ring to her and said that her brother would now always be with her in battle, not as a burden, like a hand on her shoulder. Rosalia took the ring. She looked at the engraving. Her expression didn't change. Nothing wavered. She was a soldier. She knew how to keep her composure. But the hand holding the ring was trembling. Slightly. Barely noticeable. She slipped the ring on. Min Jae put on his, and the connection was made. He felt it instantly, like an electric shock coursing through his whole body. Not pain, power. Her power flowed through the ring to him, and his, what he could give her. He's not a warrior, not a mage. He's a jeweler, but the ring better. It took from him what he could give. Calm, clarity, the ability to see the essence of things. Rosalia straightened up, her eyes widened. She looked around as if she were seeing the workshop for the first time. Every detail, every shadow, every crack. Min Jae asked what she was feeling. She replied that she was seeing. Just seeing. As if the fog that had been before her eyes for the past 3 weeks had lifted. She was silent for a long time. Then she asked quietly, "What is this?" Min Jae replied that it was called twin bonds, and that the church had banned them 200 years ago. Rosalia looked at him, at the ring on her finger, at her brother's initials in silver, and she said just one word. All right. The test came 3 days later. On the eastern outskirts of Haldenburg, a guard's body was found, torn to pieces. The tracks didn't belong to any known beast, a void beast, inside the city walls. They had never ventured this far before. Rosalia was the first to find out. She came to the workshop at night. She said she was going hunting, alone, because the 4 survivors from the squad had already resigned, and because if the creature killed anyone else in the city, the blame would fall on the guard, on her. Min Jae looked at his hands, at the ring, at the line between them that pulsed in the darkness of the workshop as if it were alive. He said he was going with her. Rosalia refused. She said he would die. He replied that perhaps he would. But the ring only works when they're together. If she went alone, she'd be without its protection, just like last time. When Victor died, it was cruel. He knew that, but it was the truth. Rosalia clenched her teeth, her fist clenched, that same habit. Then it relaxed. She nodded. They stepped out into the city at night. Haldenburg was different at night. Quiet, empty. The torches on the walls burned with a reddish glow. Long shadows stretched out. Min Jae walked behind Rosalia and felt her every step through the ring. Every breath. She was tense as a bowstring, but she wasn't afraid. She was angry. They found the creature in an alley near the eastern gate. Min Jae saw it and forgot how to breathe for a second. It wasn't a creature from fantasy books, not a dragon, not a demon. It was a piece of emptiness in the shape of a body, as if someone had cut a hole in the world and the hole had begun to move. Its contours were blurred. It had no eyes. It had no mouth. There was only movement and cold, so cold that the air around the creature was covered in frost. Rosalia drew her sword. The steel rang out. The creature turned at the sound. Min Jae felt through the ring as Rosalia focused. Everything superfluous faded away. Only she and the blade remained. And at that moment, the ring did its work. The connection between them flared up. The rumor spread faster than Min Jae had expected, not through the guards, through the laundress. The wife of the guard, who had been patrolling the frost-covered alley that morning, had mentioned it at the market. She added that they'd seen a knight with a silver ring on his finger that glowed in the dark. By lunchtime, the whole eastern quarter knew the story. By evening, it had reached the taverns. 3 days later, the first visitor, who wasn't there for a sword, came to the workshop. A middle-aged merchant, bald, with sweaty hands. He asked about the blacksmith who made rings to ward off illness. Master Hammerstein silently threw him out, but the old man's was ashen. He understood what was beginning. Min Jae understood it too, but he couldn't stop. Not because he didn't want to, because he didn't know how. In Seoul, he had worked every day. No days off, no vacations. The rings were his life. Nothing had changed here. Only the stakes had risen. Rosalia came every day. Now she didn't just stand by the forge. She brought a whetstone and sharpened her sword next to his workbench, silently, side by side. 2 pairs of hands, each doing their own thing. Sometimes she asked what he was doing. He'd explain. He'd show her how the silver settles, how copper behaves when heated, how wire retains its shape if bent correctly. She listened. She didn't understand everything, but she listened. Min Jae noticed that when Rosalia was nearby, the connection between them flowed more smoothly, more steadily. The ring worked better up close. The echo of her blood gift was clearer. He began to move with greater confidence. Not like a fighter, but like a man who knows where his feet are planted. The 20th day, a man in a gray cloak entered the workshop, quiet, unobtrusive. He sat in a corner and watched. Min Jae didn't see him with his eyes. He saw lines. A single distinct line emanated from this man. Bright, straight, like a taut cable. It led somewhere beyond the workshop. Far away, to someone beyond the city walls. This man belonged to someone else, not to himself, a spy, or a servant, or a fanatic. Someone at the other end of the line controlled him completely. Min Jae said nothing. He continued working. That evening, he told Rosalia. She nodded. She said she'd look into it. The next morning, the man in the gray coat was gone. Min Jae didn't ask what she had done. Some things are better left unknown. Day 25. A woman came to the workshop who changed everything, not by knocking on the door, not by asking. She simply stood at the entrance in the rain and waited. Min Jae saw her when he went out to take out the slag. Her black hair was wet. She was thin to the point of transparency. The bruises under her eyes were so dark they looked painted on. Her hands were slender. There were burn marks on her fingers, not from fire, but from magic. Min Jae looked at her lines and paused. There weren't many, 3, maybe 4, all severed, but not like Rosalie's. Rosalie's lines had been severed by death. Forcibly. Here the lines had been neatly cut off, by someone or by herself. This woman had been cut off from everyone she knew, or she had cut herself off. She saw that he was looking. She didn't look away. She asked directly, was he the blacksmith who made rings? Min Jae replied that he wasn't a blacksmith. He's a jeweler. She said she didn't care what he called himself. She needed to know one thing. Could he make it so she would stop fading? Her name was Evelyn Ashgrave, 22 years old, a magessa, the former heiress of the Ashgrave house, an outcast. Min Jae spent 4 days with her before he even touched the silver. It was harder than it had been with Rosalia. Rosalia was reserved, but honest. She didn't want to talk, but when she did, she told the truth. Evelyn lied constantly, not out of malice, out of habit. Sarcasm was her armor. She answered questions with a joke or a barb. Min Jae asked what she dreamed about. She said she dreamed of money and handsome men. He wondered why she wasn't sleeping. She said that the nightlife in Holdenburg was simply amazing. He asked about her family. She said she had no family, and she smirked in a way that made you want to look away. Min Jae didn't look away. He waited, just as he had waited in Seoul. Once, a couple came to him who had been arguing in the reception area for 20 minutes. He sat and waited. When they ran out of steam, he asked one question. Why do you need rings if you hate each other so much? The woman started crying. The man sat down, and they began to talk. For real! It worked with Evelyn on the 3rd day. She came to the workshop at night, uninvited, without warning. Min Jae was working at the kiln. Liesel had already gone to bed. Evelyn sat down on a bench, silently. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were red. 3 days without sleep. Min Jae didn't ask any questions. He just poured her some water. She drank it. Then she spoke, quietly. No jokes, no defenses. Her magic only works when she feels intensely anger, fear, grief, love. Any strong emotion opens a channel. The Ashgrave family considered this a flaw. A lady of noble birth should not feel. A lady of noble birth must maintain control. Her mother used to say that if Evelyn didn't learn to control herself, she might as well never have been born. She tried for years. She suppressed her emotions, and her magic faded. But when her emotions broke free, the magic broke free too, uncontrollably. Once she accidentally set her mother's dress on fire at a dinner party. Not because she wanted to, because her mother had said something. A single phrase, one that struck exactly where it shouldn't have. Evelyn burned the dress. Her mother wasn't hurt, but the family's reputation was ruined. Her father kicked her out the next day, without money, without a name, without the right to return, and without sleep, because sleep restores her magical reserves. And to fall asleep, you have to let go of control. And when she lets go of control, the nightmares come. About her mother, about the dress, about the phrase her mother said, and the magic spills out in her sleep. She wakes up in a scorched bed, or she doesn't wake up, and then the whole house burns down. That's why she doesn't sleep for 3 days at a time, for 4, until she collapses, until her body shuts down on its own. Min Jae listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he asked one thing. What was her childhood nickname? Evelyn looked at him, as if he were crazy. He repeated the question. She turned away, said she didn't remember. He knew she was lying, but he didn't press her. He just said that when she remembered, she should tell him. She left. Min Jae watched her go and thought. The 3rd ring, the last slot. If he tied himself to Evelyn, he wouldn't have any room left. 3 bonds? That's the maximum. Any more, and his soul would start to dissolve. He'd forget soul, forget his real name, forget who he was. Min Jae sat down on a bench. He closed his eyes. He thought about his studio in Itaewon, about the small workshop on the 2nd floor above the coffee shop, about the smell of resin and silver, about the client who was supposed to come for an engagement ring on the day he didn't return. The ring remained unpolished, on the workbench, in the empty workshop. No one would come for it. He swallowed hard. 3 bonds. The master with Liselle, Rosalia. And if he took Evelyn, that would be it. The ceiling. No one else. He would no longer be that link for anyone, just an observer. A master who makes rings for others, but stands on the outside himself. It was the right decision. 3 strong bonds. With those who truly needed them. Evelyn needed one. He could see it in her lines, in the scars, in the dark circles under her eyes. She was slowly killing herself with insomnia. Not metaphorically. Literally, her body wouldn't hold out for long. A month, 2, then she'd collapse and not get back up. Min Jae opened his eyes. The decision had been made even before he sat down on the bench. He knew it. He just needed a minute to sit with that knowledge. He returned to the forge. Evelyn came on the 4th day. She looked even worse. 4 days without sleep. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't hold her mug. Min Jae sat her down by the forge. The heat helped. A little. He worked beside her in silence. She watched as he hammered the silver. And on the 5th day, without sleep, when she could barely speak anymore, she said it quietly, almost in a whisper. Linny. Her childhood nickname. Linny. Her mother used to call her that when she was 5, before the magic manifested, before everything went wrong. Min Jae nodded. Linny. He remembered. The ring was ready by the morning of the 6th day. 2 silver rings. On her ring, the engraving wasn't on the outside, but on the inside, where it touched the skin. 4 letters. Linny, the 3rd month. Min Jae hadn't slept properly for 6 weeks, not completely. Evelyn's insomnia was split in half by the ring. She slept 6 hours a day. He slept 3, sometimes 4. His body was getting used to it, or breaking down. He couldn't tell the difference, but his hands worked. His fingers obeyed him. The rings turned out smoother with each passing day. The workshop had become his world. The workbench, the crucible, the silver. 4 walls, and 3 rings on his fingers that bound him to people he now knew better than he knew himself. Every morning, he woke up with pain in his right knee. That was Liesel's pain. Every day, he felt his muscles throb with a strength that did not belong to him. That was Rosalia. Every night, his mind refused to fall asleep. That was Evelyn. 3 women, 3 pains, 3 gifts. He carried them all, and he worked. Rosalia went out on patrols. Ever since they'd killed the Void Beast, Command had assigned her a new squad. A small one, 4 people, all rookies. Everyone knew their captain wore a strange ring. No one asked. Rosalia would come to the workshop in the evenings. She'd sit down at the forge. She sharpened swords in silence. Sometimes they talked, nothing important, about the weather, about grain prices, about how Gunter had thrown his apron into the slop bucket again. Rosalia said she could talk to Gunter. Min Jae said there was no need. She looked at him. He saw in her eyes that she'd already spoken to him. Gunter showed up the next day with a bruise on his cheekbone. He didn't touch the apron anymore. Evelyn had made herself at home in the workshop like a cat. Without permission. Without warning. One day, her things just appeared in the corner. Then a cot appeared. Then a book. Then 3 books. She slept during the day and stayed awake at night. When she wasn't sleeping, she sat by the forge and read, or watched Min Jae work, or made snide remarks. She was constantly making snide remarks. She called his hands too beautiful for a blacksmith. She said his rings looked like eyes, that his stubbornness was reflected in the silver. Min Jae didn't react. He was used to customers who hid tenderness behind rudeness. Half the people in Seoul were like that. Men who came in for an engagement ring and said they just needed a formal accessory. And then they'd describe their girlfriend in such a way that Min Jae understood. Not formal at all. Evelyn was the same, only instead of rudeness, she had sarcasm. And instead of a girlfriend she couldn't describe directly, she had all of them. The workshop, Liesel, him. The life she never believed she'd end up in. Liesel was growing, not physically. She was growing as a craftswoman. Min Jae taught her every evening. Not the twin bonds, just basic jewelry making. How to hold the pliers, how to feel the metal, how to see the line before it appears. Liesel was talented, her hands were delicate, her patience was endless. A month later, she made her first ring. A copper one. Simple, crooked, without magic. But hers. Min Jae looked at it and said it was better than his first. She beamed. Master Hammerstein had changed too. Not on the outside. He still forged swords. He still cursed at the apprentices. He still drank sour beer after work. But he no longer called Min Jae useless. And when one of the apprentices walked into the corner of the workshop where Min Jae was working, the master would bark so loudly that the walls shook. He was defending him, silently. Like a wall, Min Jae was grateful. But he knew that the wall wouldn't withstand what was coming. It came on the 30th day of the 3rd month, at night. Min Jae sat by the forge. Evelyn was sleeping on the cot. Liesel had gone to her room an hour ago. The workshop was quiet. Only the coals crackled. Then the door opened, quietly. Without a knock. 4 figures stood in the doorway. 3 in city guard uniforms. The 4th in a robe, white with gold embroidery. On his chest was the symbol of the single flame. A priest. Min Jae stood up, slowly. His heart was pounding, but his hands were steady. He looked at the lines. A line extended upward from the priest, not toward a person, toward something, toward a structure, toward an organization. This line was thick, rigid, like a chain. The person at the other end of this chain would not let go. The priest surveyed the workshop. His gaze lingered on Evelyn, on her ring, then at Min Jae's hands, at the 3 rings. The priest said a complaint had been filed, that forbidden rituals were being practiced in Hammerstein's workshop, that artifacts were being crafted without a license from the church, that they were using the heresy of the twin bonds. He said this calmly, like a shopping list. Min Jae replied that he was simply a blacksmith, making jewelry. Rings without magic, just fine craftsmanship. The priest smiled. He stepped up to the workbench. He reached for the ring Min Jae had been making as practice. An ordinary copper ring, no connection, no power, just a ring. The priest took it. He turned it over in his hand. He put it back. Then he turned to the guards and said that the place was clean. A mistake, a false accusation. You may go. Min Jae didn't move. Something wasn't right. The priest was leaving too easily, too calmly. At the door, the priest turned around. He looked at Min Jae and said one sentence, quietly, so the guards wouldn't hear. He said that Archbishop Kaltenbrunner knew, and that the boy had a week. Then he left. The door closed. Min Jae stood there. His hands were no longer steady. They were shaking. Archbishop Kaltenbrunner, head of the Heldenberg Inquisition. He knows. A week. 1 week. Evelyn woke up, or perhaps she hadn't been sleeping at all. She was sitting on the couch, watching him. She asked who that was. Min Jae answered. Evelyn cursed, at length, elaborately. Then she stood up. She walked over to him. She placed her hand on his shoulder. She said that if they were going to run, it had to be now. Min Jae shook his head. Not yet. Rosalia arrived in the morning. She already knew. One of the guards had told her. She arrived in armor, carrying a sword, her face stony. She said she could ask the command to transfer him to a garrison on the border, to take Min Jae along as an attached craftsman to the unit. Formally, it would be legal. Min Jae listened. He thought about it. He said no. If he were to escape under the protection of the guard, it would put Rosalia at risk. Her unit, her career, the Inquisition wouldn't touch a guard on duty, but it would go after a guard who harbors a heretic. Rosalia clenched her fist. That same habit. Min Jae saw the tension rise between them. She wanted to argue. She wanted to give orders. She was the captain. She was used to making decisions, but here she couldn't, because this was his decision. Min Jae looked at Master Hammerstein. The old man stood by the anvil. He was silent. His hands didn't tremble. His back was straight. The ring on his finger glinted dimly. Min Jae said they needed to leave. Not just him. Everyone. The workshop was no longer safe. If the Inquisition came for him, it would come for everyone around him too. For the Master. For Liesel. For Rosalia and Evelyn. Master Hammerstein looked at his workshop. At the forges that had been burning here for 40 years. At the anvil that had stood here for 100 years. At the walls within which 3 generations of his family had lived. Then he looked at Liesel, at the daughter who walks without a cane, who shapes rings with her slender fingers, who smiles every day for the first time in years. The old man closed his eyes, opened them, said he wouldn't go anywhere. This is his home, his forge, his life. He would stay. But Min Jae had to leave and take Liesel with him. Liesel began to say she wouldn't abandon her father. The master raised his hand. His voice was steady, firm like the steel he forged every day. He said she would go with Master Min Jae, that she was now a jeweler, that jewelers don't stand at the anvil. They go to those who need their hands. Liesel cried. The master did not. He slipped the ring off his finger, placed it on the workbench. His back immediately hunched. The pain returned instantly. The old man gritted his teeth but held his ground. Min Jae wanted to say he could keep the ring. The master shook his head. He said that if the Inquisition found the ring on him, it would be the end of him. Otherwise, he was just an old blacksmith, abandoned by a good-for-nothing apprentice. Min Jae took the ring. He put it in his pocket. The bond with the master was severed, not destroyed, just frozen. The ring, without a finger, would lose its power in an hour. But only he could break the bond itself, or death. The master handed him a bundle, tools, the best ones, from his personal set. Pliers with silver jaws, a small hammer for precision work, a set of files, a magnifying glass, a real one. Made of glass, with a wooden handle. Min Jae took the bundle. His hands were shaking. The master placed his hand on his shoulder, a heavy hand, just like back then, and he said, Work well, boy, don't make swords, do what you know how to do. They left that very night. Min Jae, Liesel, Rosalia, Evelyn. The 4 of them made their way through Haldenberg at night. Rosalia knew the way, the west gate, through the old cemetery, past the abandoned church, to the forest road leading west. Min Jae carried the bundle of tools, pressing it to his chest like a child. Liesel walked beside him, without her cane, the ring on her finger. She kept looking back. Every 10 steps, she looked back, at the town, at the workshop, at the only home she knew. Min Jae took her by the hand. She squeezed his fingers, tightly. They passed through the gate just as the sky in the east began to grow light. Behind them, Haldenberg was waking up. Somewhere out there, Master Hammerstein stood at his anvil, alone, with a bad back, and he was forging swords just as he always had. Min Jae didn't look back. If he had, he wouldn't have been able to leave. The forest path was narrow. The trees closed in overhead. The forest temple turned out to be better than it looked from the outside. The walls were thick. The stonework was old but sturdy. The roof leaked in only one spot, over the far corner. Rosalia plugged the hole with a bundle of fir branches and smeared it with resin. In 2 days, they had turned an empty shell into a home. Min Jae turned the altar niche into a workbench. The stone slab was flat and wide, better than anything he'd had in Haldenberg. They built the hearth out of river stones, round ones, smooth ones. Evelyn looked at the structure and said it was a disgrace to engineering. Then she snapped her fingers and a fire flared up among the stones, even hot, without firewood. A magical hearth. Min Jae looked at the flame, then at Evelyn, then back at the flame. He asked how long she could keep the fire going. She shrugged. As long as she feels something. He asked what she was feeling right now. She said she was annoyed by his questions. The fire burned steadily. Annoyance. Fits, too. Min Jae smirked and sat down at the workbench. For the first week at the temple, he worked like a man possessed. Not on the rings, on the tools. From the scraps of iron that Rosalia had found in the ruins of the old garrison, he forged 3 new files. From the bone of a deer that Rosalia herself had shot on the third day, he carved a handle for a magnifying glass. From clay by the stream, he made a crucible. Small, crooked, but it worked. Liesel helped. She was already holding the pliers with confidence. Min Jae showed her how to read the metal. Not with her eyes, with her fingers. Silver speaks when you bend it. If you listen, if you take your time. Liesel listened. She took her time. In Seoul, Min Jae hadn't taught anyone. He hadn't had any students, not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't explain it. His hands knew what to do. His mind didn't know how to put it into words. Here it was different. Here he saw lines. He saw how the metal responded to intention. He saw the connection between the craftsman and the material. And he could show it. Not tell it, show it. Liesel watched his hand and repeated the movements. She didn't copy. She repeated them in her own way. Her lines were different, thinner, softer. Where Min Jae saw a pattern, she saw a flow, like water. He made rings like a building. She made them like a stream. Different, but both correct. Min Jae looked at her work and thought that in 5 years she would be better than him, if she survived that long. The 10th day in the forest. Rosalia went on a reconnaissance mission to the nearest village. She returned in the evening. Her face was stern. The news was bad. The Inquisition had declared him a heretic binder. A bounty had been placed on his head, 200 gold pieces. Min Jae asked if that was a lot. Rosalia said that for 200 gold pieces, even his own mother would turn him in. Evelyn added that for 200 gold pieces, a stranger's mother would turn him in. Min Jae nodded. 200 gold pieces. All right, now he knows his worth. Rosalia also said that in the village, people are talking about the void beings. There are more of them now. Before, they only appeared at the border. Now they're being seen in the forests, closer to the towns. 2 villages to the west have been burned down, not by fire, but by the void. The people didn't burn. They vanished. Only the houses and their belongings remained. And the cold, frost on the walls in the middle of summer. Min Jae listened and thought, the void beasts. The church's blessings don't work. The knight's gifts of blood don't work. Ordinary steel is useless against them. But his ring worked. Why? Because of the connection. Paired bonds, a power that comes neither from blood nor from the church, from 2 people, from the choice to be together. Maybe that's why the church banned it 200 years ago, not because it's dangerous, but because it works, and it works without the church. On the 12th day, Rosalia brought a hunter from the village. The old man had found something in the forest. Tracks, not animal tracks, hollow ones, cold imprints on the ground. The grass beneath them had turned black. The tracks led north, to the stream, to their stream. Min Jae stepped out of the temple. He looked at the forest. The trees stood still. Birds were singing. The stream was babbling. Nothing indicated danger, but he could sense it through Rosalia's ring. Her body was tense. Her gift of blood hummed like a taut string. She could sense the creature somewhere nearby. Min Jae returned to the temple. He looked at the workbench, at the silver, at the rings. He had a plan, a crazy one, but a plan nonetheless. That evening, he gathered everyone together, Rosalie, Evelyn, and Liesel. He sat down on a stone slab and said he wanted to make a ring. Not for himself, for 2 other people. To bind Rosalia and someone else. Without his own involvement, a matching ring for 2 where he isn't a party to the bond. He'd never done this before. He didn't know if it would work. But if it did, it would change everything. Because then, his limit of 3 bonds would no longer be a ceiling. He'd be able to make rings for everyone, for any 2 people, without the risk of losing himself. Rosalia asked who. Min Jae replied that he didn't know yet. He needed a second person. Someone compatible with Rosalia. Someone whose line would connect with hers. He saw Rosalia's lines every day. Severed. Dead. 17 ends with no continuation. But there were others. Thin ones. New ones. Ones that had begun to grow in recent weeks. Toward Liesel. Toward Evelyn. Toward him. And one very thin, almost invisible, somewhere into the forest. Min Jae followed it with his eyes. The line ran north. Past the stream, past the trees, toward someone he hadn't seen yet, but who was there, nearby. They found her on the 14th day. Not them. Liesel found her. She'd gone to the stream to fetch water. She came running back, pale. She said there was an elf sitting by the stream, barefoot in a tattered dress, and talking to the fish. Min Jae went to the stream. Rosalia followed him, her hand on her sword. Evelyn stayed at the temple. She said she was allergic to the forest. She was lying, of course. She just didn't want to get her shoes wet. A girl was sitting on a rock by the stream, small, thin, her bare feet in the water. Long hair, silvery, not gray. Silvery, exactly, like the wire in his workshop. Her ears were long and pointed. She was actually talking to the fish, or rather, she was humming something, quietly, in a language Min Jae didn't know. The fish in the stream stood motionless, listening. Min Jae looked at the lines and stopped. This girl had one line, just one. But what a line! It radiated from her in all directions at once, not toward people, toward the trees, toward the water, toward the earth, toward the sky. It was connected to everything alive around her, but to no single living creature in particular, a total connection with the world, and absolute loneliness among people. Rosalia stopped behind him. Min Jae could feel through the ring how she tensed up, not out of fear, out of recognition. She saw before her the loneliness she herself knew, only in a different form. The girl raised her head. She looked at them. Her eyes were green, old, much older than her face. Much older than anyone Min Jae had ever met in either world. She smiled simply and openly, like a child, and said that the fish said they were good people. Min Jae didn't know how to respond. Neither did Rosalia. The girl's name was Neil Sylvaen. She didn't say how old she was. She looked about 19. Her eyes spoke of centuries. An elf, a healer, banished by her forest home for healing humans during the last border war. The elves considered it treason. Human lives aren't worth an elven gift. She said this without bitterness. As a matter of fact, she had been living alone in the forest for 8 years. She healed animals. She talked to trees. She sang lullabies to the fish. She avoided people until she sensed them. She sensed the rings. She didn't know what they were, but she sensed a vibration, like a sound you hear not with your ears, but with your skin. She came to take a look. She found Liesel. She was surprised. A human girl who wasn't afraid. Min Jae brought her to the temple. Neil walked in and immediately started touching everything in sight. The stones of the walls, Evelyn's cot, the tools on the workbench, Liesel. She touched Liesel on the arm, on the shoulder, in the hair. Liesel stood there, not knowing what to do. Evelyn said that this was an invasion of personal space. Neil didn't understand the word. She asked what personal space was. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it. Then she burst out laughing, for the first time in front of Min Jae. Genuine laughter, without sarcasm, without defensiveness. Just laughter. Neil smiled. She didn't get the joke, but she liked the sound of it. Min Jae watched them. He looked at the line, and he saw what he'd been looking for. A line ran between Neil and Rosalia, a new one. A thin one, but a vivid one. Brighter than he'd expected. Two women who'd lost everything. One had lost her unit and her brother. The other had lost her people and her home. Different losses. The same emptiness. The line between them was like a bridge over an abyss, thin, but real. Min Jae made up his mind. He told Neil that he wanted to make a ring for her, a pair with Rosalia's. Neil didn't know what a ring was. Not in the sense that she didn't know the object itself. She didn't know why people wore them, Min Jae explained, briefly, simply. The ring would connect her to Rosalia. They would share strength, share sensations. Neil would feel Rosalia. Rosalia would feel Neil. They would become stronger together. Neil asked why. Min Jae looked at her, into eyes older than both their lifetimes combined, and said it was so she would no longer have to talk, only with fish. Neil was silent for a moment. Then she said that fish make good conversation partners. Min Jae replied that he didn't disagree, but Rosalia wasn't bad either. Neil looked at Rosalia. Rosalia was standing against the wall. Her arms were crossed. Her face was stony. She didn't look like a good conversationalist. She looked like a wall. But Neil wasn't looking at her face. She was looking in the same direction as Min Jae, at the line, or something like it. She nodded. For 3 days, Min Jae had been getting to know Neil. It was unlike any of his previous experiences. She didn't lie like Evelyn. She didn't stay silent like Rosalia. She answered everything, instantly, without a filter. He asked what she was afraid of. She said silence. Not when people are quiet, when sounds stop, when the forest falls silent. That means something has died. He asked what she dreamed about. She said she dreamed of her mother, singing a lullaby every night. He asked which one. Neil fell silent for the first time in 3 days. Then she began to hum softly. In Elvish, the melody was simple, 5 notes, up and down, like a stream flowing over rocks. Min Jae listened. He closed his eyes. He memorized every note. Then he asked her to sing it again. Neil sang it again. Then once more. For 3 days in a row, he asked her to sing. She sang the same lullaby every time. Each time, Min Jae heard a new nuance, a new detail. On the 3rd day, he asked her to write down the words. She didn't know how to write in the common tongue, but she wrote runes, Elvish ones, on a piece of bark. 7 runes, 7 words. Min Jae transcribed them onto paper, then onto silver. The rings were ready by the morning of the 4th day. 2 silver rings, for Rosalia and Neil. The 7 Elvish runes were woven into the pattern on both rings. Neil's mother's lullaby, the one she sang to her when Neil was little, before the exile, before the loneliness, before the forest became her only home. Min Jae was not part of this bond. For the first time, he stood on the outside. He watched. He held out the rings to both of them. Rosalia took hers. She looked at the runes. She didn't understand, but she put it on. Neil took hers. She looked at the runes. She understood. She froze. Her fingers clenched the ring so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She stood there, staring at the 7 runes she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 8 years. Then she slipped the ring on. The bond was sealed. Min Jae felt nothing. It wasn't his bond, but he saw it. The line between Rosalia and Neil flared up. Not thin, not new. Full, alive, burning with silver. The silver ran out a week after Neil's ring. Min Jae sat at his workbench, staring at the empty box. 2 spools of wire had gone into making 4 rings. 3 ingots went toward practice pieces and training Lissel. There was exactly nothing left. There was copper, there was bronze, there was plenty of iron. But silver is the foundation. Silver maintains a connection better than other metals. It's purer. It lasts longer. A copper ring works, but it's weaker. A connection through copper is like talking through a wall. You can hear it, but you can't make out the words. Silver is an open door. Gold would be a window spanning the entire wall. But gold in this world was so expensive that it would be easier to steal a dragon. Min Jae needed a city, a market, a supplier, and money. He had none of the 3. Rosalia suggested going to the nearest city, Marburg, a free city on the western border, not under the direct authority of the crown, not under the direct authority of the church, a trading hub. You can buy silver there, you can sell your services there, and there. The Inquisition has no right to arrest anyone without the city council's consent. Min Jae asked how she knew this. Rosalia replied that her unit had been stationed in Marburg 2 years ago. She knows the city, she knows the people, she knows the ins and outs. Min Jae asked about the bounty on his head. 200 gold pieces. Rosalia said that in Marburg, for 200 gold pieces, people would be more likely to hide you than turn you in. The city thrives on trade, and trade favors those who do what no one else does. They set out the next morning, all 5 of them. They left the temple empty, nothing of value. Min Jae carried his tools in a bundle on his back. Lissel carried the crucible. Evelyn carried her books and pretended they were heavy. Rosalia walked ahead. Neil walked barefoot and sang something to the trees. The trees didn't answer, but the birds picked up the melody. It was a 3-day journey. Min Jae didn't sleep, as usual, just 3 hours a day. Evelyn's insomnia wouldn't let him rest, but he was used to it. His body had adapted or perhaps simply given up. At night, he sat by the campfire and thought about his workshop. In Seoul, his studio had been 20 square meters, 2 workbenches, a display case, a shelf with tools, a chair for clients, a teapot. That was enough. Here, he needed the same thing, only without the display case and without the teapot, although a teapot wouldn't have hurt either. Marburg appeared on the 4th day. The city stood in a bend of the river, stone walls, low, not for defense. To mark the boundaries, the gates were open. Guards checked the carts but let pedestrians through without question. Min Jae entered the city and stopped. The smells. Roasted meat, leather, smoke, spices, manure, fish, all at once. Like a punch to the nose. After the forest, the city seemed deafening, but inside something stirred within Min Jae. Familiar, urban. He was a city person, in Seoul, in Heldenburg, everywhere. The forest had been a respite. The city is life. They found a room in a tavern by the river, one room for the 5 of them. Cramped, but cheap. Rosalia paid with her savings, her last month's guard's pay. It would last 2 weeks, then the money would run out. Min Jae needed to start earning a living. He spent his first day in Marburg scouting around. He walked through the market. He found the jewelry district. 3 shops, all of them sold imported goods. Hallmarks from the capital, thin chains, earrings with cheap stones, rings with coats of arms, nothing handmade and nothing unique. Min Jae walked into one of the shops. A girl was sitting behind the counter. Young, black-haired, with slanted eyes. Min Jae stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. She spoke to him in the common language. She asked what he wanted. He answered, then he fell silent. Because there were letters on the sign above the door, not in the common language, in Korean. He read them 3 times, then once more. Then he turned to the girl and asked in Korean, "Can you read the sign?" The girl dropped the earring she was holding. She picked it up. She dropped it again. She looked at him and answered in Korean. The accent was different, older, more archaic, but it was Korean, real Korean. Min Jae stood in a stranger's shop in a strange city in a strange world and heard his native language. For the first time in 3 months, his eyes stung. He clenched his teeth. Not now, not here, later. The girl's name was Kim Ha-yoon, 20 years old, half Korean. Her father was from the Havo trading diasporas, a people from across the sea, eastern, with a language and script that Min Jae would recognize among 1,000, because it was his language, changed over the centuries, simplified, distorted in places. But his. Her mother was local, from Marburg. Ha-yoon grew up between 2 worlds. She spoke both languages. She belonged to neither. Her father had died 2 years ago. He'd left her the shop. She ran it alone. She sold jewelry brought in from the capital. She resold it at a markup. She lived modestly. She didn't complain. Min Jae sat in her shop for 4 hours. They spoke in Korean about things that didn't matter, about how the Haijo brew tea, not quite like in Seoul, but similar, about how Haijo runes are written, not Hangul, but Hangul's ancestor, or descendant. Min Jae couldn't tell, but he could read those symbols, and they read him. Ha-yoon listened. She asked questions, smart ones, precise ones. She didn't ask where he was from. She didn't ask why he spoke the Haijo language more fluently than the Hajo themselves. She asked what he could do. Min Jae showed her a ring, a copper one, a practice ring, without magic, just fine craftsmanship. Ha-yoon took it, turned it over in her hand, held it up to the light. She placed it on the counter. She said that in Marburg, they'd give 5 silver coins for something like that. In the capital, 10 if it had a gem 20. Min Jae asked where to buy silver. Ha-yoon named the price. He did the math. From 1 silver ingot, he could make 3 rings, 5 silver coins each. That's a total of 15 silver coins with an investment of 3, a net profit of 12. If he worked every day, if he found regular customers, if they didn't get burned. Ha-yoon said she could sell his work through her shop for a commissioned 20. Min Jae said 15. She said 18. He said 15. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said 16, and not a coin less. He held out his hand. She shook it. The handshake was firm, businesslike, no frills. Min Jae stepped out of the shop and leaned against the wall. He exhaled. A partner, a supplier, a point of sale. 3 out of 3 in a single day. He returned to the tavern. He told the others. Rosalia nodded. Evelyn asked who the girl was and why he'd spent 4 hours with her. His tone was neutral, too neutral. Min Jae replied that she was his business partner. Evelyn said that 4 hours was a long time for business negotiations. Neil asked if the girl was pretty. Min Jae didn't answer. Lysel giggled. For the next 2 weeks, Min Jae worked every day from dawn to dusk. They traded the room in the tavern for a basement, cheaper, darker, but they could set up a workbench in the basement. Rosalia dragged a table from an abandoned warehouse. Evelyn lit the bellows with a single flick of her finger. Min Jae laid out his tools. A workshop? His third one. The first in Haldenberg, the second in the Forest Temple, the third in the basement of a tavern in Marburg. Each one was less convenient than the last. Each one was better than the last in terms of what he could make there. He forged rings, simple ones, without paired bonds, fine jewelry, rings, earrings, pendants, brooches, anything that could be made from silver and sold. Ha-Yun sold them, quickly. His work sold out in a day, sometimes in half a day. Marburg had never seen handcrafted jewelry of this caliber. The mass-produced items from the capital didn't even come close. After a week, they had money. After 2 weeks, they had steady orders. After 3 weeks, there was a line outside Ha-Yun's shop. Min Jae couldn't keep up. Lissel helped out. Simple pieces, earrings, chains. Her work was rougher than his, but she had her own style. Smoothness, fluidity, the customers liked it. Ha-Yun began selling their work separately, his under the master's brand, hers under the apprentice's. Both lines sold well. Min Jae watched Liesel as she worked. She was no longer the girl with the stick. She was a master craftswoman, with a tool in her hands, with silver dust on her cheeks, with a ring on her finger that kept her leg alive. He was proud, quietly. He didn't tell her, but he was. At the end of the 3rd week, Ha-Yun came down to the basement. She brought tea, real tea, not the local herbal swill, dried leaves brought by Haijo merchants from across the sea. Min Jae took a cup, inhaled the steam, closed his eyes. Soul. The coffee shop below his workshop, the smell of roasted beans mixed with the scent of silver. He opened his eyes. The basement in Marburg. But the tea was just right. Ha-Yun was sitting across from him, drinking hers in silence. Then she said she wanted to propose something, not as a business partner, as a person. She had a space, 1 floor above the shop, empty. Her father used to store merchandise there. Now it stood vacant. 2 rooms, windows facing the street. You could live there, you could work there. Cheaper than the tavern's basement. Min Jae looked at her, at the lines on her face. Ha-Yun had few connections. To her father, severed long ago. To her mother, faint and distant. To a few people in town, business ties, not personal ones. A different kind of loneliness, not like Neil's, not all-encompassing, business-like. She was surrounded by people, but none were close to her. Min Jae finished his tea. He said he agreed, but he would pay the full price. No discount, no gift.
A business relationship. Ha-Yun nodded. Her expression didn't change, but the line between them grew slightly brighter. They moved in the next day, 2 rooms above Ha-Yun's shop. One was a workshop, the other living quarters, cramped. 5 people in 1 room. Rosalia slept by the door, a soldier's habit. Evelyn by the window, to get some air. Liesel between them, Neil on the floor.
She said the floor was closer to the ground, and the ground was home. No one argued. Min Jae slept by the workbench. When he slept, 3 hours, sometimes 4, the workshop was running. Money was coming in. Their reputation was growing. Min Jae made jewelry during the day and thought about rings at night. Matching pairs. Real ones. He hadn't made them here yet, in Marburg. So far, only simple jewelry. But he knew that sooner or later someone would come, not for earrings, for something else. They arrived at the end of his 1st month in Marburg, the 5th month since Min Jae's awakening in this world. A gray-haired couple, an old man and an old woman. She was about 70. She walked with difficulty. He was leading her by the hand. Both were dressed in old clothes, clean but old, peasants. They entered Ha-Yun's shop and asked for the master. Ha-Yun called for Min Jae. He came down from the workshop. He looked at them. A line, a single line, between them. Bright, powerful, pulsating. 50 years together. The line was as thick as a rope, and there was a knot in it. Dark, heavy, illness. She was dying. Slowly. The healers had given up. The old man spoke softly. They knew the master made expensive things. That wasn't why they were there. They had brought everything they had. He poured it out onto the counter. 8 copper coins and a ring, a wedding ring, thin, crooked, homemade. He'd forged it himself 50 years ago, when he was a young apprentice, not a jeweler, a blacksmith, hammering iron. and with that same hammer, with that same hand, he'd bent the ring for his wife. Crooked, ugly, but his. The old man asked to have the ring remade, so he could give her some of his time. He wouldn't live long without her anyway. Min Jae looked at the crooked ring on the counter. He was silent. For a long time, then he handed the old man the coins, all 8 of them. He told him to keep the ring until morning and to come back together. The old man wanted to argue. Min Jae shook his head. No need money, just one thing, that they come tomorrow, both of them. Together, the old man took the coins. He looked at his wife. She smiled, weakly, but she smiled. They left. Min Jae took the ring and went up to the workshop. He worked all night, not 3 hours, all night, without sleep. Evelyn's insomnia helped 6th month. The workshop above Ha-Yoon's shop was open every day. Min Jae did 2 kinds of work. During the day, jewelry to sell. At night, matching rings for those who came in. There weren't many, not yet. 3 pairs a month. Newlyweds from the bakery on the next street. She was afraid of water after nearly drowning as a child. He was a fisherman. The ring cut her fear in half. Now she could stand on the shore when he went out to sea. Without panic, without tears. The blacksmith's 2 brothers, one went blind, the other limped. The ring didn't cure either condition, but it divided them. The blind man began to see in shadows. The lame man's limp grew lighter. Together they worked better than they did separately. Mother and daughter. The daughter had been mute since birth. The mother could hear but could not speak the language her daughter understood, sign language. The daughter communicated through signs. The mother knew not a single one. The ring did not give the daughter a voice, but it gave the mother fragments of her daughter's thoughts, shadows of words, sensations. For the first time in her life, the mother understood what her daughter thought of her every night before falling asleep. They both cried. Min Jae turned away toward the mountain. As always, every time he made a ring, something changed within him. Not ability, not power, understanding. With each pair, he saw more deeply. The lines became clearer, more detailed. He began to see not only the connections, but also their nature. This connection is built on the fear of loss. This one on guilt. This one on habit. This one on true love that doesn't know its own name. Min Jae took notes, not on paper, in his head, a catalog of relationships, a catalog of people, a catalog of the rings he had made and those he would yet make. He had one just like this in Seoul, a mental one, every couple, every ring, every story. He remembered them all. It would be the same here. Ha-Yoon handled the finances. She turned out to be the best business partner Min Jae could have dreamed of, tough, precise. Not a single coin slipped by. She kept the books. She calculated expenses. She haggled with silver suppliers so that they left feeling honored to have sold at a lower price. Min Jae watched her work and thought that back in Seoul, she would be running a corporation. They spoke Korean. Always. When they were alone. It became their private space, a language no one around them understood. Ha-Yoon told him about her father, how he taught her to count on the abacus he'd brought from overseas, how he used to say that the Haijo had to stick together because here they weren't considered one of their own. About how he died alone in the shop one night, and she found him in the morning, behind the counter with a book in his hands. Min Jae listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer to make her a ring. Ha-Yoon didn't need a ring. She needed something else. A home, a place where she wasn't a half-breed or an outsider, where her language wasn't a curiosity, but the norm. Min Jae made a sign for her, not a ring, a sign for the shop, made of silver wire bent into Korean letters. Hangul, or rather, what passed for Hangul in this world. Hajio runes, the shop's name. House of Silver. 3 symbols. Simple, beautiful, their bone. He hung the sign above the door, next to the old one in the common language. Ha-Yoon stepped out onto the street. She looked at the sign. She stood there for a minute. Silently, then she turned and went inside. She said the tea was getting cold. Her voice was steady, no hand. Min Jae didn't look at her face. He knew what was there. He'd seen it hundreds of times. In Seoul, when a customer picks up a ring and realizes it's not just a beautiful thing, it's his thing. For him. Only for him. Ha-Yoon didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The tea was hot, just right, with leaves from across the sea that spoke louder than words. The 7th month, word had reached those Min Jae feared, not the Inquisition. It was too early for them. The mercenaries. The first one came at night, alone. Quiet, professional. He scaled the wall into the backyard. Rosalia was waiting for him by the door. She hadn't been sleeping. She rarely slept soundly anyway. A soldier's sleep. Every sound is a threat. The mercenary turned out to be fast, but not faster than a knight with the twin ring. Rosalia sensed every movement through the ring connecting her to Neil. The elf's healing intuition gave her a sense of the living bodies around her. She knew where the mercenary was before he even entered. The fight was brief. The mercenary lay on the floor with his arm twisted out of joint. Rosalia stood over him. She asked who had sent him. He didn't answer. Rosalia pressed him. He said he'd come for a reward, 200 gold pieces. He worked on his own, not for the Inquisition, just for the money. Rosalia threw him back over the wall. She told him that if he came back, she wouldn't throw him out. Min Jae stood on the stairs and watched. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger. He wasn't used to getting angry. Back in Seoul, he'd get angry when a client brought in a competitor's ring and asked to have it remade. A petty professional pride. Here, they were hunting him down. They wanted to kill him for making rings, for healing people, for working. Rosalia placed her hand on his shoulder. It felt heavy, a metal gauntlet. Cold metal, but through the ring, he felt warmth. She said she could handle it, that this was her job, to protect. Min Jae looked at her, at the scar on her cheek, at the gray hair at her temples, at the gloved hand on his shoulder. He nodded. The second mercenary arrived a week later, with 3 assistants, at night, across the roof. This time, Rosalia wasn't alone. Evelyn was standing by the window. Her hands were on fire, literally. The flames licked her fingers from her wrists to her fingertips. Her eyes were ablaze, not metaphorically, orange. She was angry. She hadn't slept. The 4 mercenaries on the roof saw the woman on fire and froze. One tried to fire his crossbow. Evelyn burned the bolt in midair. Then she burned the crossbow. Then she looked at the mercenary and asked if he wanted her to continue. The mercenary decided he didn't want her to. They left, quickly. 5 days. Min Jae worked harder than he ever had before. Not in Seoul, not in Haldenberg, not in the Forest Temple. He started before dawn and finished after midnight. 3 hours of sleep, sometimes 2. Evelyn's insomnia, which had once been a curse, had become a tool. He couldn't sleep, so he would work. Ha-Yoon organized everything. She put up a sign in the shop in 2 languages, Common and Hajeo, that read, "The master is seeing patients, free of charge. For those in need, please come in pairs." A line formed on the first day, not a long one. 7 couples, people were skeptical. Free meant a trap, or poor quality, or a cult. Min Jae went out to meet them. He looked. He saw the lines. 7 couples. 7 different stories. He sent 2 couples home, not because he couldn't help them, because their lines were rotten. The first couple, a husband and wife, he beat her. The line between them was black, twisted, like a noose. Min Jae looked at her, looked at him, said he wouldn't make the ring. The husband started yelling. Rosalia stepped out from behind the door. The husband stopped yelling. He left. The wife stayed. She stood there. Min Jae told her quietly that a ring for a couple like that would bind her to him even tighter. But she didn't need to be bound tighter. She needed to leave. She looked at him, then at Rosalia. Then she left. Min Jae didn't know what would become of her. But he knew that the ring would have made things worse. He isn't a mass producer. He's a master craftsman. A master says no when he has to. The second couple he turned away was simpler. 2 merchants. They wanted a ring for good luck in business. The connection between them was strictly businesslike, dry, without warmth. Min Jae told them his rings weren't for business. They took offense. They left. He accepted the 5 remaining couples. He talked with each one. He asked questions. He listened. He got to know them. Then he worked. 1 ring per night. By morning, it was ready. On the second day, 12 couples came. Min Jae accepted 8. He turned away 4. 2 for the same reasons as before. 2 because their bond was so strong that the ring would be like medicine for the healthy. No need. He told them this directly. You don't need a ring, you're already connected. Just live your lives. They left, puzzled, but satisfied. On the third day, 20 couples came. Min Jae couldn't take 20. Physically, 1 ring takes a night's work, 2 at most if they're simple. He needed help. Liesel. He called her over to the workbench, told her it was time. She turned pale, said she didn't know how to make matching rings, only simple ones. Min Jae replied that she made the blanks. He did the finishing work, the connection, the pattern, the engraving. She prepares the metal. He weaves life into it. Liesel nodded. Her hands were shaking, but she sat down at the workbench and began to work. By nightfall, she had made 5 blanks. Even, clean, ready for the final finishing touches. Min Jae took the first one. He looked at it, ran his finger along the metal. Perfect. Liesel's flowing line. Soft, perfect. He smiled. She saw the smile and exhaled. As if she'd been holding her breath for 3 hours, 3 days, 5 days. Min Jae made 13 pairs of matching rings. 13 pairs, 13 stories, 13 sleepless nights. By the 5th morning, he could barely stand. His knees were buckling. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurry. The Inquisition squad arrived 9 days later. Not a week, not 2 weeks, 9 days. Ha-Yun had miscalculated, or perhaps the Inquisition was moving faster than usual. 30 men, 20 soldiers in light armor, 5 junior priests with the symbols of the flame on their chests, 4 bounty hunters, mercenaries, professionals, and 1 man at the front, tall, thin, gray-haired, in a white robe trimmed with gold. Archbishop Severin Kaltenbrunner. He had come in person. Min Jae stood on the roof of Ha-Yun's shop and watched as the column entered through the eastern gate. Rosalia stood beside him, her hand on her sword, her face stony. Through the ring, he could sense her. She wasn't afraid. She was counting. 30, 20 soldiers, 5 priests, 4 hunters, 1 archbishop. Against her alone, it would be impossible. But she wasn't alone. Min Jae looked down at the square below. People were standing there. Townspeople. Not an army, not a militia, ordinary people. A baker and his wife, both wearing rings, 2 blacksmith brothers, both wearing rings, a mother and her daughter, both wearing rings. Sisters, elderly people, newlyweds, everyone. 17 couples, 34 people, each wearing a matching ring, stood in the square in front of the shop. They weren't blocking the street. They weren't building barricades. They were simply standing there and watching the Inquisition's procession as it marched toward them. Ha-Yun had organized this. No slogans, no weapons, no provocations. Just people standing by the shop where they buy jewelry. They have the right. This is a free city. Kaltenbrunner stopped the procession in the square. He looked at the people, at the rings on their fingers, at the shop, at the sign in 2 languages. Then he looked up and saw Min Jae on the roof. Their eyes met. Min Jae saw the archbishop's lines. There were many of them, dozens. But they all led in one direction, toward the structure, toward the church, toward faith, not a single personal line, not a single connection to a living person, only to an idea. This man did not belong to himself. He belonged to the church, completely. Kaltenbrunner dismounted. He walked across the square. People parted, not out of fear, out of respect for his office. Marburg is a trading town. Here, people respect authority, but they do not bow down to it. The archbishop stopped at the door of a shop. He looked up. He said he wanted to talk, not to arrest him, just to talk. Min Jae looked at Rosalia. She shook her head, barely noticeably. Don't go. Min Jae looked out at the square. 34 people in the rings, 30 soldiers of the Inquisition. If a fight breaks out, people will get hurt. Ordinary people. His people. The ones for whom he made the rings. He went downstairs. Ha-Yun intercepted him at the stairs. She said it was a trap. Min Jae replied that he knew. But if he didn't go out, Kaltenbrunner would come in himself. And with him, 30 men. Better one-on-one. Ha-Yun pressed her lips together. She wanted to say something else. She didn't. She stepped back. Min Jae stepped out onto the square. Kaltenbrunner was standing 3 steps away. Up close, he looked older than he had from a distance. Wrinkles around his eyes. Dark circles. A man who sleeps little, not from insomnia, but from work, from responsibility, because of his faith. Kaltenbrunner looked at Min Jae's hands, at the 3 rings, then at the people around him, at their rings, then back at Min Jae. He said he knew who he was. He knew what he was doing. He knew that 200 years ago, another master had done the same thing, and he knew how it had ended. Min Jae replied that he didn't know what had ended 200 years ago. Kaltenbrunner explained, briefly, without emotion, 200 years ago, a master craftswoman named Siren forged 9 rings. 2 months had passed since the Inquisition left. The 8th and 9th months since Minjo's awakening in this world. The workshop was in full swing. Every day, no days off, non-stop. Min Jae made the rings. Liesel prepared the blanks. Hayun handled the business. Rosalia stood guard. Evelyn tended the forge and grumbled at everyone. Neil treated the cuts and burns that are inevitable in jewelry work, and she sang. She always sang. Quietly, in the background, like a radio that no one turns off because it's too quiet without it. People made their way to the workshop, not in crowds, in a trickle. 1 couple a day, sometimes 2, sometimes none. Word of the blacksmith with the skilled hands spread through the villages, through the taverns. Along the trade routes, people came from far away, from neighboring towns, from villages 2 days' journey away. They would arrive and wait, sometimes for a week, because Min Jae didn't accept everyone and not right away. First, a conversation, for hours, for days, then a decision, then the work, then the ring. He didn't rush. He couldn't rush. Every ring is a life. 2 lives. If he made a mistake, if he didn't see it, if he didn't understand, the ring wouldn't help, or worse, it would do harm. Kaltenbrunner was right about one thing. The ring amplifies what's already there. Min Jae had to be certain of what was there. He made a mistake once. The 10th month. A couple came. Young, beautiful. He was from a merchant family. She was from a family of artisans. The connection between them was vivid, warm, alive. Min Jae looked and saw love, pure, real. He spoke with both of them. For 2 days, he learned their story. He learned their fears. He learned their dreams. Everything fell into place. Everything was just right. He made the rings. He slipped them on their fingers. The bond was sealed. They left happy. 3 days later, Hayun came to the workshop with news. The girl had returned home, alone, without the ring. She said she didn't want to wear it anymore. Min Jae went down to the shop. The girl was sitting behind the counter. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. Min Jae asked what had happened, she replied. The ring had shown her his thoughts, in fragments, as shadows, just as it should. But among the shadows was one she hadn't expected. Another woman. He was thinking of someone else, not constantly, not obsessively, but enough for the ring to convey it to her. The love was real, but not the only one. He loved 2 women, and he'd been hiding it. Without the ring, she wouldn't have found out. With the ring, she found out in 3 days. Min Jae sat there in silence. He saw a line. Bright, clear, but he didn't see the second one. Thinner, quieter, hidden, deep inside. He was wrong. The ring didn't lie. The ring revealed a truth he hadn't seen. The girl asked if she could take the ring off. Min Jae explained. A ring removed from the finger loses its power after an hour. The connection can be broken, but it hurts, like an amputation. She looked at him. She said that an amputation was better than knowing he was thinking about someone else every evening. Min Jae took the ring off her finger. She flinched, bit her lip. Then she stood up and left. Min Jae held the ring in his hand, warm, pulsing. In an hour, it would go out. It would become just silver, beautiful, dead. He placed it on the workbench, next to the tools. The first mistake. It wouldn't be the last, but he wouldn't make a mistake like that again. Now he knew. A single bright line is enough. You have to look deeper. Look for shadows. Look for what they're hiding, not just from each other, from themselves. Evelyn found him that evening. He was sitting by the extinguished forge, alone, in the dark. She sat down beside him. She didn't ask what had happened. She knew. Liesel had told her. Evelyn was silent for a moment. Then she said it wasn't his fault, that people lie, always, to everyone, and to themselves first and foremost, that it's impossible to see everything, even with his eyes. Min Jae replied that he had to see. It was his job. It was his gift. It was the only thing he knew how to do. Evelyn said he was an idiot. Min Jae said she'd already said that. She said she'd repeat it as many times as necessary. Then she leaned her shoulder against him, silently. The ring on his finger pulsed. Her calmness flowed toward him. His guilt flowed toward her, but she didn't pull away. She bore it, just as he had borne her sleepless. Min Jae closed his eyes. He exhaled a mistake. One mistake in 10 months. This isn't the end. It's a lesson. In Seoul, he'd made mistakes too. Once, he made a ring for a couple who divorced 3 months later. The wife brought the ring back. She placed it on the display case. She said the ring was beautiful, but the marriage wasn't. Min Jae hadn't slept for 2 days back then. Then he got up and went to work. It's the same here. Get up, work, do better. He opened his eyes. He looked at Evelyn. She was asleep on his shoulder, for the first time not on the cot, not by the window, on his shoulder. Her face was relaxed, no sarcasm, no defenses, just a girl who had finally fallen asleep next to the one she trusted. Min Jae didn't move. He sat there. He looked at the extinguished blowtorch, at the dark workshop, at the ring on the workbench that was slowly fading. And he thought, 10 months. 3 rings on his fingers. Dozens of rings for others. 1 mistake, 1 workshop, 1 family, one he'd never had. Not in Seoul. Not here, until now. He thought about Master Hammerstein, alone, with a bad back in an empty workshop. He thought about Rosalie, who sleeps by the door every night. About Neil, who sings to the fish. About Liesel, who makes rings better than he did at her age. About Hyun, who brews tea just right and never says thank you, because thank you is for strangers. About Evelyn, who sleeps on his shoulder and calls him an idiot. He thought about Kaltenbrunner, about the archbishop who retreated but didn't give up. Who is watching? Who is waiting for a mistake? The first mistake happened. Observers in the city saw it. The girl who returned the ring. It will be in the report. Min Jae knew Kaltenbrunner would use this. Not now. Later, when enough had accumulated. When it would be possible to say, see, rings are dangerous. Rings destroy. Rings break people. Min Jae had to be flawless. From now on, every ring had to be perfect. Not a single mistake. Not a single crack. Not a single couple that falls apart. It's impossible. He knew that. People change. Love ends. Couples drift apart. That's life. A ring isn't a shield against life. A ring is an amplifier. If love fades, the ring will reveal it before words do. More painfully than words, but more honestly. Perhaps that is its true value. Not to heal, not to bind, to reveal the truth. Min Jae smiled in the darkness. A jeweler who reveals the truth. In Seoul, his clients cried as they slipped on their rings, not all out of happiness, some out of a realization, because, for the first time, they saw in the silver what they knew but were afraid to admit, that they love, that they are loved, that it's real. Here, the silver does the same thing, only louder. Evelyn sighed in her sleep. She shifted. She settled in more comfortably. Min Jae didn't move. 3 hours until dawn. He wouldn't be sleeping. Insomnia wouldn't let him, but that's normal. He's used to it. In the morning, he'll get up, light the forge, grab his tongs, and start working. Just like always, just like in Seoul, just like here, just like everywhere. Because he's a jeweler, and that's the only thing he knows how to do. Make rings for those who love, and turn his back to the forge so no one can see his face. The 11th month, Sister Clara arrived in Marburg. Not with a detachment, not with a sword, alone. In gray traveling clothes without the symbols of the flame. Min Jae saw her before she entered the shop. He saw the lines, 2 of them. One led to the church. Thick, rigid, like a chain, but with cracks. Countless cracks. The chain was breaking. The second line led downward, toward someone far away, thin, warm, familiar, family, a mother or a sister. Someone she loved. Someone who was dying. Clara entered the shop. Her red hair was tucked under a scarf. Her eyes were gray. Serious. Her face was young, but her gaze was old. She looked at Min Jae. She looked at the rings on his fingers. Then she said she hadn't come from the Inquisition. She'd come on her own. Hyun stood between them. Min Jae shook his head. He said to let her speak. Clara spoke for a long time. Standing, she didn't sit down. She didn't accept any water. She stood upright, as if in confession. Only she wasn't confessing to God. She was confessing to him. She was a spy. 2 months ago, when the Inquisition retreated, Kaltenbrunner left observers in the city. She was one of them. A junior priestess, 27 years old, an idealist. She sincerely believed she was protecting the world from heresy, that the twin bonds were evil, that the church was right. For 2 months, she walked the streets of Marburg. She observed. She took notes. She saw how Min Jae worked. She saw a couple he refused to work with because the husband beat his wife. She saw elderly people who left holding hands. She saw a mother who, for the first time, understood her mute daughter. She saw sisters. She saw newlyweds. She saw everything, and her faith cracked, not from a single blow, from 1,000 small ones. Every day, every ring, every couple, every time Min Jae turned away toward the furnace. She wrote reports to Kaltenbrunner, honest, detailed, and with every report, it became harder for her, because the facts didn't fit with what the church had been saying for 200 years. The bonds of union aren't a bomb. They aren't a weapon. They're a tool in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing, in the hands of a master who says no when necessary. Clara fell silent. Then she explained why she'd come. Her mother, in a village 3 days' journey from Marburg. Her mother is sick, the healers have given up, the church's blessings aren't helping. She has a younger sister, 16 years old, healthy, strong, ready to give up anything. Clara asked if he could make a ring for her mother and sister. Min Jae looked at her, at the cracks in the chain that led to the church, at the thin, warm thread that led to her mother. He asked one thing. Why hadn't she asked the church? Clara closed her eyes, opened them. As she said, she had asked 3 times. They told her that the illness was a trial from the flame, that she needed to pray. That treatment cost money she didn't have. Min Jae nodded. He stood up. He said he needed 3 days to get to know his mother and sister, to understand them, to make the ring right. Clara asked how much it would cost. Min Jae shook his head. Nothing. Clara stood there. Her expression didn't change, but her hands were trembling. She clenched them into fists, hid them behind her back. But Min Jae had already seen. He went with her. Rosalia wanted to go. Min Jae said there was no need. If he went with a knight in armor, it would look like a raid. He would go with Clara, alone. Ha-Yun said it was madness. She was a spy for the Inquisition. She might lead him into a trap. Min Jae looked at Clara, at her connection. The cracks in her bond with the church were growing by the hour. Her connection to her mother was burning. This wasn't a trap. It was desperation. He set off, a 3-day journey on horseback. Clara was silent most of the way. Min Jae didn't press her. He waited. On the 2nd day, she spoke. About her mother. About how her mother used to sing to her before bed. About how her mother sewed dresses for the whole village and never took money from the poor. About how her mother taught her that the flame is not heat but light, that faith is not fear but hope. Clara spoke, and her voice broke, not from tears, from anger. She was angry at the church, which taught her one thing but did another, at herself, who had believed for so long that she failed to see the obvious, at the world, which forces one to choose between faith and one's mother. Min Jae listened. He memorized every word, every gesture, every break in her voice. He was getting to know Clara, not as a spy, as a daughter. The village was small, 20 houses. Her mother lay in bed, thin, pale, hands like birds' feet. But her eyes were clear, strong. She saw Clara and smiled. She saw Min Jae and frowned. She asked who he was. Clara said he was a craftsman who makes rings. The mother looked at Min Jae for a long time. Then she said she'd heard about him, that the villagers were talking, that the church was talking, that she didn't know who to believe. Min Jae sat down next to the bed. He said he wasn't asking her to believe him. He was asking her to tell him about her youngest daughter. His mother spoke for an hour, about the youngest, about Anna, 16 years old, stubborn, cheerful, strong. She looked like her father, who had died when she was 5. As his mother spoke, her eyes shone. Not from illness, from love. Min Jae saw the connection between them, vivid, powerful, like the one between old people with a crooked ring, only younger, hotter. Anna came in from the field, tanned, with dirty hands, with straw in her hair. She looked at Min Jae. She asked if he was the blacksmith. Min Jae said he was a jeweler. She said it didn't matter to her. Could he help her mother? Min Jae said he could. Anna nodded. There were no more questions. He worked through the night. In the village smithy, it was small, dirty, with leaky leather doors. He brought the silver with him, the last ingot from his reserves. The rings turned out simple. No intricate patterns, no frills. On her mother's ring was a small flower. Anna explained that her mother loved cornflowers. On Anna's ring was an ear of wheat. Her mother explained that Anna ran out into the field every morning. That morning, he put the rings on them. The connection was made. Her mother sighed deeply for the first time in months. Part of the illness flowed over to Anna. Part of Anna's strength flowed over to her mother. Her mother didn't recover. The ring doesn't heal. The ring shares. But she sat up in bed, on her own, without help. She asked for tea. Anna ran to fetch water. Clara stood in the doorway, watching. The next morning, she came to Min Jae. She placed the symbol of the flame on the table, silver. On a chain, the insignia of a priestess of the one flame. She said she had nowhere to return to. She asked if he would take her. Min Jae looked at the symbol on the table. At Clara, at the cracks in the chain connecting her to the church, which were now no longer cracks, but a complete rupture. The chain had snapped. Clara stood free. And lost. He took the symbol, turned it over in his hand. Silver. Fine. Pure. Church silver is always of the highest quality. He smiled. He said he'd melt it down into a ring, if she didn't mind. Clara didn't answer, but the corner of her mouth twitched. Almost a smile. The four of them returned to Marburg, Min Jae, Clara, and 2 villagers who wanted to live closer to the master, not her mother and Anna. 2 other families, who had seen the rings and came to ask for their own. The workshop was growing, not in size, but in people. Ha-Yun greeted Clara without a smile. Evelyn greeted Clara with open hostility. She said that letting an Inquisition spy into the workshop wasn't just madness, it was clinical stupidity. Min Jae replied that Clara was no longer a spy. Evelyn asked how he knew. Min Jae said he could see the lines. Evelyn said he'd seen those lines in that couple who broke up 3 days later. Min Jae fell silent. She was right. He'd been wrong. He could be wrong again. But Clara stood before him with empty hands and a broken chain behind her back. And he knew. He hadn't seen it. He knew. Just as he'd known in Seoul. When a client came in for real, not for the ring. For a home, Clara stayed. The first few days, she didn't know what to do, didn't know where to turn. For 27 years, she had lived by the church's rules. Wake up, prayer, service, prayer, lights out. Without those rules, she felt lost. Min Jae gave her a job. Not in jewelry. She didn't know work with her hands. He gave her books, archival records that Ha-Yun had obtained from merchants, old texts about the paired bonds, fragments. Copies of copies. Clara knew church Latin. She knew the archival language. She could read what others could not. She read at night, just as Min Jae worked at night. 2 people who didn't sleep for different reasons. He because of insomnia. Evelyn because she had found meaning. A week later, Clara came to him, pale, with trembling hands, with a sheet of paper covered in tiny handwriting. She said she had found something in an old text. A fragment from the archives that a dealer had sold as wrapping paper. The fragment spoke of Siren, of the last ring, of the fact that Siren had not been burned. Min Jae sat down. Intently, Clara explained. The text was damaged. Half the words were missing, but the gist was clear. Siren had asked the church to stage an execution. She had found a way to pass into another world, not to die, to leave, to be transported. The text called it the Gates of Blood. Siren had left, and in the archives, she had left a ritual for her return, in case the void returned, so that her descendants could return. Min Jae sat quietly. Descendants. His hands rested on his knees. 3 rings glinted in the candlelight, Clara continued. The most important part was at the end. Damaged, almost illegible, but she had made it out. 20 years ago, a young novice, while reading old texts in the archives, had accidentally activated part of the ritual. The novice's name was Clara. Min Jae looked at her. Clara wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the floor. Her hands were shaking. She said she didn't know. She was 7 years old. She had been playing in the archives while her mother worked at the temple. She found a scroll. She read it aloud. Beautiful words. She thought it was a prayer. Nothing happened. She forgot. She forgot for 20 years, until she read that passage and realized the ritual had worked. Not right away. 20 years later, it had been waiting, searching. It found the closest descendant of the Saren bloodline in the world where she had gone, and pulled him out. Min Jae didn't die on the highway by accident. He was literally pulled out of the car at the moment of death. They transported him across worlds. They placed him in the body that was closest to what was needed. Slender hands, calluses like a jeweler's, a place in the forge. Everything had been prepared. Not by someone. A ritual. A blind force that a 7-year-old girl had unleashed by reading the scroll. Min Jae was silent for a long time. Clara stood before him, waiting for him to speak, to get angry, to accuse her, to drive her away. He looked at her, at the broken chain behind her back, at the line leading to her mother, at the new line, a thin one. That led to him, to the workshop, to these people. He said one thing, so he wasn't here by accident. All right, let's keep working. He stood up, walked over to the furnace. Clara stood there, breathing. Then she sat down on a bench, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know what to pray for, but she knew who to sit next to. The 12th month, a year since he'd awakened, Min Jae stood at the workbench and counted 47 rings. In a year, 47 pairs, 94 people bound by silver and truth, 3 rings on his fingers, one with Liesel, one with Rosalia, one with Evelyn. All 3 glowed evenly, steadily, without fail. The pain in his knee had become as familiar as breathing. Rosalia's strength, echoing in his muscles, had become second nature. Evelyn's insomnia was no longer a curse. 3 hours of sleep was his norm now. It was enough. His body had adapted. Or perhaps he had adapted to his body. The distinction had blurred. The workshop above Ha-Yun's shop had become cramped. 2 workbenches. One was his, one belonged to Liesel. Clara sat at a desk with papers, tools on the shelves, silver in the drawers, finished rings in boxes, cramped but bustling. Min Jae needed more space, more people, more silver. Ha-Yun found a place. A former dye house on the riverbank. Large, stone-built, with high ceilings, with windows overlooking the water, 3 rooms, one for the workshop, one for the shop, one for living quarters. And a courtyard, a real courtyard with a stone wall. The price was high. Min Jae looked at the bill, then at Ha-Yun. She said they had the money. His rings were selling. The jewelry shop was bringing in a steady income. Plus, 4 wealthy families from Marburg had paid full price for matching rings. Not everyone came for free. Those who could pay did, and they paid generously. Min Jae bought the dye house. They moved in 2 days later. Rosalia hauled the furniture. All by herself. She refused any help. Evelyn lit the new furnace. It was bigger than the old one, more powerful. Neil planted flowers in the yard. Liesel set out the tools. Clara organized the papers. Ha-Yun hung up the sign. In 2 languages, the common language and Hagio, House of Silver. Min Jae stood in the middle of the new workshop. Spacious, bright, smelling of paint and the river. And he thought of the studio in Itaewon, 20 square meters, 2nd floor, a display window, a teapot. This place was bigger, much bigger, but the feeling was the same. A home, his home, which he had built with his own hands, not just his own, 6 pairs of hands, but a home. The first month in the new workshop flew by. Orders were coming in more frequently. People were coming from Marburg, from the villages, from far away. Min Jae couldn't keep up. Liesel helped, but he needed more hands. He thought it over and made a decision. Apprentices, not masters of the paired bonds. He couldn't teach that. That gift was his alone, innate, hereditary. But he could teach the craft of jewelry making. Liesel was already a master. He needed 2 more, 3. People who would make simple rings, earrings, pendants, jewelry, so that he could focus on the paired ones. Ha-Yun posted an announcement. 12 people showed up. Min Jae looked at each one. at their hands, at their lines, at their eyes. He chose two. A 14-year-old boy, the son of a potter. Small hands, precise, patient. And a 30-year-old woman, the blacksmith's widow. Strong hands, confident, she knows metal. Both began their training. Min Jae taught them, just as he had taught Lisel. Not with words, by demonstration. Do as I do. Watch my hands, feel the metal, listen to the silver. Another project was underway at the same time, a secret one. Clara had found more fragments of Siren's archive. Pieces, scraps, but a picture was emerging from the scraps. Siren had forged 9 rings, 8 for 8 pairs of warriors, 1 for herself, the last one. Siren's ring was special. It didn't bind her to another person. It bound her to all 8 pairs at once. She was the hub, the center, the conductor. Through her ring, she coordinated all 8 bonds. She amplified them. She guided them. She suppressed them when necessary. This ring had been the key to victory over the Void 200 years ago, and it still existed somewhere in the church's archives, in a vault that Clara knew about because she had worked there 3 years ago, when she was still a faithful priestess. The vault was located in Haldenberg, beneath the main cathedral, in the basement behind 3 doors sealed with church seals. Min Jae listened. He thought, Haldenberg, the city he had fled from. The city where Master Hammerstein stands at his anvil with a bad back. The city where the Inquisition knows his face. He looked at Clara, asked if she could take him inside. Clara turned pale, said she could, but that would be a betrayal of everything she was. Min Jae said she had already betrayed him when she removed the symbol, when she stayed in the workshop, when she chose her mother over the church. This was simply the next step. Clara closed her eyes. She opened them. She nodded. The 4 of them set off, Min Jae, Rosalia, Evelyn, and Clara. Neil stayed in Marburg with Liesel and Hyun to guard the workshop. It was a 3-day journey to Haldenburg. Min Jae hadn't been here for 9 months. The city hadn't changed. The same walls, the same streets, the same smell of iron and smoke. But he had changed. 9 months ago, he had fled from here, skinny, frightened, with 3 rings and a bundle of tools. Now he had returned with 3 rings, with 3 women, with 47 paired rings on his back, and with the knowledge of who he was, a descendant of the Sirens, a master of paired bonds. Not a chance occurrence. Chosen. They entered at night, through the western gates, the very same ones through which they had left. Clara led the way. She knew the city, she knew the temple, she knew the basement. Rosalia walked beside Min Jae, her hand on her sword. Through the ring he could sense her. Focus, readiness, not a trace of fear, only cold calculation. Evelyn walked behind them. Her fingers glowed faintly in the darkness. She hadn't slept for 2 days. The ring shared her sleeplessness with Min Jae. Both were on the edge. But both kept walking. The temple was enormous. White stone, golden domes, symbols of the flame on every wall. At night, it seemed less like a building and more like a creature, sleeping. Enormous. Clara led them through a side entrance. A service entrance. For the priestesses who clean the altar at dawn. She unlocked the door with the key she hadn't turned in when she left. Inside it was quiet, echoing. The stone vaults absorbed the sounds. 3 doors leading down. Clara unlocked the first one with her key. Evelyn unlocked the second. The lock melted at her touch, silently. They didn't open the third one. The third door was sealed with a church seal. A magical one, not a lock, not a bolt. Power, the seal of the single flame. Only the archbishop could break it. Or someone with power equal to that of the church. Min Jae looked at the seal, at the lines of power radiating from it into the walls, into the stone, into the temple's foundation. The seal was fueled by faith. Literally, every prayer uttered in this temple over the past 200 years had strengthened the seal. 200 years of prayers, thousands of voices, millions of words, an impenetrable wall of faith. Min Jae placed his hand on the door. He closed his eyes. The 3 rings on his fingers pulsed. A connection to Liesel, far away. In Marburg, faint but alive. The connection with Rosalia, close by, hot, steely. The connection with Evelyn, close by, burning, bright. He's not a mage, not a knight, not a priest. He doesn't have the power to break through this door, but he has something else. Connections. 3 connections. And 47 rings throughout Westmar, each bearing the imprint of his work, his gift, his essence. He didn't know if it would work, but he tried, not to strike, not to break, to show. He pressed the 3 rings against the seal and opened the connections. All 3, at once. Liselle in Marburg shuddered in her sleep. Rosalia, right beside her, shuddered in reality. Evelyn flared up like a torch. Min Jae sensed all 3 of them at once. Liselle's pain, Rosalia's strength, Evelyn's fire, all at once. Through him, through the rings, through his hands, into the seal. The seal did not break. It recognized him, just as a lock recognizes a key. The seal was made to hold the siren's ring, and Min Jae was a descendant of the sirens. His gift was her gift. His blood was her blood. 200 years of prayers met 20 generations of blood, and the door opened. Quietly, without a creak, as if it had been waiting. It was dark inside. A small room, stone walls, a single pedestal in the center. On the pedestal, a casket. Inside the casket, a ring. Silver, old, dull, but alive. Min Jae sensed it before he saw it, like a heartbeat in an empty room. Siren's ring, the last of the 9, the one she'd made for herself, the one that connected her to all the others, the one that made her the conductor. He reached out, took the ring, slipped it onto his finger, and at that moment, for a single second, he saw her. A woman. Not young, not old, wearing a jeweler's apron, exactly the same as his, silver dust on her fingers, wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, a smile. She stood before him. Siren, his ancestor, 20 generations back. She smiled and spoke in Korean, fluent, without an accent. She said he'd taken a long time to get there, great-grandson. She told him to do his work well, and not to marry off those who don't love each other. Then she vanished. Min Jae stood in the dark room, with Sirene's ring on his ring finger. 4 rings. For a second, he panicked. 4. The limit is 3. His soul will begin to expand. He would forget himself. But the panic subsided. The Siren ring wasn't a bond with another person. It was a bond with his craft, with his gift, with himself. It didn't count toward the limit. It simply was. Like breathing, like a pulse, a part of him, always. He turned to the others. Rosalia stood by the door, sword drawn, eyes on the stairs. Evelyn stood beside her. Her hands were burning, eyes wide. Clara stood behind them, pale, hands on the wall. She was looking at Min Jae, at the ring of the sirens. And there was something new on her face. Not faith, not doubt. Understanding. Min Jae said it was time to leave. They left the temple as quietly as they had entered, through a side door, into Haldenberg at night. And they headed for the gate. On the way, Min Jae stopped. He looked toward Hammerstein's workshop, a dark street, familiar walls. The horn wasn't lit. Night. The master was asleep, with his back hunched, without the ring, alone. Min Jae took the ring out of his pocket, the first one, the one he had made in this world for the master, the one the master had taken off and given to him 9 months ago. He placed the ring on the workshop's threshold. The master would find it in the morning. He would understand. Min Jae walked away, without looking back. Just like the first time, the 13th month, the void beasts emerged from the forests. Before they'd stayed at the border, then in the forests. Now they were marching toward the cities. 3 villages had vanished in a week. They hadn't burned down. They hadn't been destroyed. They had simply vanished. The people were gone. The houses stood empty. Frost on the walls. Cold in the air. Emptiness. Marburg was preparing. The city council hired mercenaries, fortified the walls, closed the gates at night, but everyone at the walls wouldn't help. Ordinary steel is no match for the void beasts. Church blessings don't work. A knight's gifts of blood weaken upon contact with the void. Nothing works, except for one thing. Min Jae sat in his workshop making rings, not jewelry, paired rings, combat rings, for those who would defend Marburg. Rosalia brought her new squad, 10 people, guards who had left the royal service with her, loyal to her, not to the crown. Min Jae looked at them, at the lines between them. 5 pairs, not romantic, combat pairs, 2 who cover each other's backs. 2 who are stronger together than alone, partners, teammates, brothers in arms. Min Jae recalled Kaltenbrunner's words. The sirens bound those whom they were ordered to, not those who chose each other. Here it was different. These 5 pairs had chosen each other themselves, side by side for years, in battle, on guard duty, through mud and blood. Their bonds weren't romantic, but they were real, strong. time-tested. Min Jae worked for 5 days, 5 pairs, 10 rings, each with its own pattern. For the two swordsmen, he wove the pattern of their paired technique into the design, a strike from the right and a block from the left, a movement they'd practiced until it became second nature over 7 years together. For the two archers, he wove the trajectory of the arrow's trajectory, straight and arcing. They shot differently, but together they covered the entire field. For the rest, their own. For each, their own. As always, the rings worked, the paired duos moved faster. More precisely, they sensed each other without words. The swordsman would dodge a strike a second before his partner shouted because he sensed it through the ring. Danger. From there. Right now. And the siren ring on Min Jae's finger was doing something he hadn't expected. It resonated with every ring he had ever made. It didn't command. It didn't control. It sensed. Min Jae stood in his workshop and sensed all his rings at once. 52. All across Westmar, each like a hot spot on the map in his head. He sensed the old men in Marburg, the mother and daughter in Clara's village, the blacksmith brothers, the newlyweds from the bakery, everyone, all alive, all connected, all burning. The first creature arrived at Marburg 8 days later, at night. Min Jae sensed it through Niel and Rosalia's ring. Niel could sense the living, and the void creature was the antithesis of life, a hole in the fabric of the world. Niel shuddered and woke up. Rosalia woke up at the same time. Through the ring, they went out together, Rosalia with her sword, Niel barefoot. Behind them, the squad. 10 people in paired rings. Min Jae stayed in the workshop. His place wasn't on the battlefield. His place was here, by the forge, at the workbench. He was the conductor, not the soloist. He sat down on a bench. He closed his eyes. He placed his hands on his knees. 4 rings on his fingers. A connection to Liesel, to Rosalia, to Evelyn, and Siren's ring, which linked him to all the rings at once. He could feel the battle. He couldn't see it. He could feel it. Rosalia moved ahead, fiery, steely. Her sword struck with precision. The ring with Niel gave her a sense of the living. She knew where the creature was thicker, where it was thinner, where to strike. Niel stood behind her. Healing power flowed through the ring to Rosalia. Every cut healed in seconds. Every bruise faded away. Rosalia was nearly invulnerable, as long as Niel was by her side, as long as the ring was on her finger. 5 pairs of swordsmen and archers worked like clockwork. Through the rings, they moved in perfect sync. 10 bodies, 1 purpose. Min Jae could sense each of them. Through Siren's ring, he wasn't controlling them. He was observing. When a swordsman from the 3rd pair was struck by the creature on his shield, Min Jae felt the pain. Not his own, his. Through the chain of rings, and through that same chain, he channeled a portion of Niel's healing power to him. Not all of it, just a drop, but enough so that his arm wouldn't give out, so that the shield would hold, so that his partner would have time to strike. The creature fell 20 minutes later. It disintegrated. It melted into frost on the rocks. The squad stood in silence, unscathed, the 15th month. Min Jae sat in his workshop reading a letter from Kaltenbrunner, not an ultimatum, not a threat, an invitation. The archbishop was requesting a meeting, one-on-one, in a neutral location, without soldiers, no weapons. Kaltenbrunner wrote that the church was in crisis. The void beasts were advancing. Blessings were not working. Knights were perishing. The only thing stopping the void were the rings made by the jeweler from Marburg. The church can no longer deny this. Half the parish in Haldenberg knows. The soldiers at the border know. The command knows. The king knows. Kaltenbrunner wrote that there is a schism within the church. Some of the priests want to recognize the paired bonds, to legalize them, to allow them. Some want to destroy Min Jae and everything he has created before it's too late. Kaltenbrunner stood in the middle, and he wanted to talk. Min Jae showed the letter to Rosalia. She read it. She said, no. Min Jae showed the letter to Hayun. She read it. She said it was politics, and that in politics, an invitation to talk is either the beginning of peace or the beginning of the end. Min Jae asked which of the two it was. Hayun said it depended on what he brought with him. Min Jae looked at his hands. 4 rings, dozens of connections. his workshop, his students, the city that had rallied behind him, and the truth about the sirens, about the ritual, about why he was here. He went alone, Rosalia argued, for a long time, fiercely. For the first time, she raised her voice. She said that if he died, all the rings would go dark, all the bonds would be severed. Everyone who depended on him would lose everything. Min Jae replied that this was precisely why Kaltenbrunner wouldn't kill him, because it wouldn't kill just one person. It would kill 52 bonds, 104 people, and the hope that the void could be stopped. Rosalia fell silent. She clenched her fist. Then she unclenched it. Then she did something she'd never done before. She removed the gauntlet from her left hand. She placed it on the workbench next to his tools. And she left. Min Jae stared at the gauntlet, at the worn metal, at the sword scratches, at the fingers she'd left exposed. Unprotected, he understood. The gauntlet was her. Next to his tools, she was right there beside him, left behind, waiting. He picked up the gauntlet, placed it with the tools, gently, and set off. The meeting was in a village, halfway between Marburg and Haldenberg, a small inn. Empty, Kaltenbrunner sat at a table by the window. Without his robe and simple traveling clothes, he looked older, more worn, bags under his eyes. His hands were on the table. Unarmed, Min Jae sat across from him. They looked at each other. Min Jae saw the archbishop's features. They had changed. Before, everything led to the church, a single thick chain. Now the chain had thinned, and others had appeared, thin ones, new ones, leading to the people, to the soldiers at the border, toward priests who doubt, toward villages that are disappearing. Kaltenbrunner had begun to change, not faith itself, the direction of faith. The archbishop spoke quietly, without grandstanding. He said that the void was stronger than it had been 200 years ago. That last time, Siren had stopped it with 9 rings and 18 warriors. That now more was needed, much more. That the church could not provide what was needed. Blessings don't cut through the void. The gifts of blood are weakening. The only thing that works are bonds. Paired bonds. Rings, his rings. Min Jae listened. Kaltenbrunner said he was ready to offer a deal. The church would legalize paired bonds. Officially, lift the ban, recognize Min Jae as a master, and grant him access to the Siren archives, the complete ones, not just fragments, everything. In exchange, Min Jae would make rings for the army, for the soldiers on the border, for everyone who would fight the void. Min Jae shook his head, slowly. Kaltenbrunner frowned. He asked what was wrong. Min Jae replied. He said he wouldn't make rings for the army, not because he didn't want to stop the void, because the army is an order. These are pairs who didn't choose each other. That was the Sirens 200 years ago. Rings for those who were placed side by side, not for those who stood side by side of their own accord. That's what destroyed the cities last time. Kaltenbrunner turned pale. He said that people were dying, that villages were disappearing, that there was no time to wait for the soldiers to fall in love with each other. Min Jae replied that they didn't need to love each other. They needed to choose, on their own, voluntarily, to come to him, both of them, of their own free will, to tell him about themselves, to let him see, to let him understand, and then he would make a ring, for each couple, for free, as many as needed, but by their own choice, not by the general's order, not by the church's decree, by their own free will. Kaltenbrunner was silent for a long time. He looked out the window. Then he turned around. He asked quietly, "What if there aren't enough volunteers?" Min Jae replied that there would be enough, because people want to protect those they love. They don't need an order. They need permission. The archbishop looked at him, at his hands, at his rings, at the face of the jeweler from another world who sat before him and spoke the words the church had been afraid to utter for 200 years. Kaltenbrunner stood up. He said he would think it over. And he left. Min Jae remained alone in the empty inn. He sat there. He looked out the window. He thought, would it work or not? 3 days later, the answer came. Not in a letter, in a decree, a royal decree bearing the church's seal, signed by the king, certified by Archbishop Kaltenbrunner. The decree read, "The ban on paired bonds is lifted. Master Ringbinder Min Jae of Marburg is recognized as a master of the guild. He is permitted to take on apprentices, to open workshops, to make rings freely, legally, for anyone who comes of their own free will. Min Jae held the decree in his hands. The paper was heavy, the seal was gold, the words were official, but between the lines, he read something else. Kaltenbrunner hadn't given up. Kaltenbrunner had made a choice between the fear of the past and the hope of the present. He chose hope, not forever, not unconditionally, but he chose. Hyun read the decree. She did some quick calculations in her head. Then she said they needed an accountant, and a lawyer, and a second room. Min Jae laughed. Then he looked at the workshop, at the workbench, at the anvil, at Master Hammerstein's tools, at the rings on the shelves, at Liesel, who was standing at the second workbench, making a ring, her own, without his help. T17th one this month. He looked at Rosalia. She was standing by the door. There was no glove on her hand. Her left hand was bare. Unprotected. He walked over to her, held out the glove. She took it, didn't put it on, placed it on her belt. Her left hand remained bare. He understood. She wouldn't put it on. She didn't need protection anymore, with him by her side. Evelyn was sitting by the window, reading a book. She looked up. She said that if he thought legalization would solve all the problems, then he was an even bigger idiot than she'd thought. Minjag said it wouldn't. Evelyn said, "Then why are you smiling?" He didn't answer, but he didn't wipe the smile off his face. Neil was singing in the courtyard, quietly, a lullaby that very one. Clara sat next to her and listened. For the first time in her life, she was listening to something that wasn't a prayer, and it was better than any prayer. The third year. Min Jae was sitting at the workbench in his workshop, not in the basement, not in the forest temple, not above Hyun's shop, in his own workshop, a large one, made of stone with 4 workbenches, with a forge that burned steadily because Evelyn had cast a permanent flame upon it and said that it was a gift, not a favor, and that he must not thank her. 3 windows. Light fell on the silver and shattered into dozens of tiny suns on the walls. Liesel was working at the first workbench, 17 years old. No cane, a ring on her finger. Her hands were steady, quick. She was making a ring for a customer from a neighboring town. Simple, fine jewelry, without paired knots, but beautiful. Her style, flowing, smooth, unlike his. Thomas was seated at the second workbench, an apprentice. The former son of a potter, 15 years old, slender fingers, patience, a year of training. He was already making pieces that took customers' breath away. He was not a master of the twin knots. He never would be. But he was a jeweler, a true one. Min Jae was proud of him. At the third workbench sat Martha, a blacksmith's widow, 31 years old, strong hands. She made pieces rougher than Liesel's, but with such honesty in every line that people chose her work not for its beauty, but for its truth. At the fourth workbench sat Min Jae. He was working, as always. 2 small rings lay before him. Silver, simple, for an engagement. The customers were sitting on a bench by the door, 2 of them, young, country folk. He was 18, she was 17. He was a shepherd. She was a miller's daughter. They had arrived that morning, on foot, a 2-day journey. They brought the money they'd saved up over the course of a year. Min Jae looked at them. On the line, a single line. Bright, young, passionate, pure as the first snow. No cracks, no knots, no shadows. Just 2 people who love each other and want rings. Not matching, not magical. Ordinary, engagement rings. Min Jae could have made them matching bonds. They were a good fit. The bond was perfect, but they didn't ask, and they didn't need to. Sometimes a ring is just a ring. Beautiful, silver, with initials inside. No magic, no connection, no echo of others' gifts. Just a promise. One that 2 people make to each other. It's not the ring that makes the bond. The bond creates the bond. The ring is just a reminder. He worked for 4 hours. Not all night. 4 hours. His hands knew what to do. His new body had long since become his own. 3 years ago, he'd woken up on an anvil with someone else's hands. Now those hands were his. Every callus, every scar, every curve of his fingers. The rings turned out simple, 2 silver bands, engraved with his initials, and her little flower. Min Jae had learned that she loved poppies because he asked, just as he always did. He held out the rings. The guy took them. His hands were shaking with excitement. He slipped one onto her finger. She slipped one onto his finger. Nothing happened. No spark, no electric shock, no magic. Just silver on a finger. But the girl started to cry, and the guy started to cry. And Min Jae turned away toward the forge. As always, Liesel stood nearby, smiling quietly. She'd seen this dozens of times, and every time she smiled, they left. Min Jae sat at his workbench. He stared at the empty spot where the rings had lain. He thought, 3 years. In 3 years, he'd made 231 rings, 112 matching pairs. The rest were simple ones, jewelry. He remembered every single one. He remembered every pair, every story. The catalog in his head had grown into a library. The void beasts had been driven back to the border. He wasn't alone. The army, the knights, mages. But at the center stood the couples in rings, volunteers, hundreds of them, who came of their own accord. As he told Kaltenbrunner, people don't need an order, they need permission. They came, soldiers who had fought side by side for years, healers who worked in pairs, scouts who covered for one. They came to Min Jae. They told him about themselves. They let him see, and he made rings for each pair, just as he had promised. 2 masters worked in the first paired bonds workshop in the capital, Min Jae and his apprentice, to whom he had passed on his gift. Not Liesel. She was a jeweler, not a bondsmaster. The apprentice's name was Yang, a former novice of the church, 20 years old, who had watched Min Jae work and realized he wanted to do exactly the same thing. Min Jae couldn't pass on his mastery, but he could pass on knowledge. The ability to see lines came to Yang after a year of working alongside him, weaker than Min Jae's, dimmer, but enough. The siren ring resonated with him, as with a descendant, as with an heir to the craft, if not by blood. Min Jae looked at the workshop, at the 4 workbenches, at the 3 windows, at the silver suns on the walls. Then he looked at his hands. 4 rings, the bond with Liesel. The nagging pain in his knee became a background noise. Constant. Familiar. He'd been carrying it for 3 years. He'd carry it on. The connection to Rosalia strengthened his muscles, clarity in his eyes. She was in the capital, commanding a new squad.
She came every evening. She sat down at the forge. She held the sword. Silently, just like on the first day.
Only now without a glove on her left hand, the connection with Evelyn. The insomnia had eased. It hadn't gone away, it had eased. He slept 4 hours now, sometimes 5. Evelyn slept 7. The difference was split evenly. She still called him an idiot. Less often, but still. She ran a magic workshop next to his studio. She made amulets, not rings, amulets. Her magic had finally found a form that didn't require rage. Through the ring, through the calm that flowed from it, she could cast spells not out of anger, but out of warmth. Not always, but more often than before. Neil lived in the garden next to the workshop, literally in the garden. She'd refused a room, saying the walls were suffocating. She slept under a tree she had planted herself. Rosalia came to see her every morning. They sat in silence. No words were needed. The ring spoke for them. The bond between the knight and the elf was the quietest and strongest of any Min Jae had ever seen. Clara, a priestess without a church. She had found her faith, not in the flame, not in the bonds, in people. She kept the workshop's records. She recorded every ring, every pair, every story. She did what the church hadn't done for 200 years. She documented, honestly, uncensored. Her records would become the foundation of a new doctrine, not ecclesiastical but artisanal, so that in 200 years, no one could declare it heresy again. Because facts are harder to burn than people. And Haeyun sat in the office behind the wall, counting. As always, a sign in 2 languages hung above the door. House of Silver. She now managed 3 workshops. Marburg, Haldenberg, a free port on the coast, a retail network. Silver shipments, contracts, accounting, a corporation. Just as Min Jae had predicted, they still drank tea together, every evening, in Korean. Their space, their language, their silence. Min Jae never made her a ring, not a matching one, not a piece of jewelry, not any kind. She didn't ask. he didn't offer. Between them was something that didn't need silver, something that grew on its own, slowly, like tea steeping. The sign above the door was their ring, 3 symbols in Korean. House of Silver. That was enough. Min Jae got up from the workbench. He went out into the courtyard. Evening. The sun was setting behind the rooftops of Marburg. The sky was reddish, like horn, like Clara's hair, like Evelyn's flame. In the courtyard, Neil was sitting under a tree and singing. Quietly, a lullaby, that very one. 5 notes, up and down. Next to her was Liesel, without her cane, with a ring on her finger, with silver dust on her cheeks. Next to her was Thomas with a piece of wire and an expression of intense concentration. Next to her was Martha. Quiet, calm, at ease. Standing by the gate was Rosalia, without a glove, with a sword at her belt. She was looking at the sunset. Min Jae approached her. He stood beside her. She didn't turn around, but she shifted slightly closer, shoulder to shoulder, through the ring. He could feel her, calm. Not the usual kind, something new, as if what had been stretched tight as a bowstring for 20 years had finally loosened. Not broken, just loosened. Min Jae stood and watched the sunset, at his courtyard, at his people, at the workshop he had built, at the life he had pieced together through the ring, through the bond, through the person. He thought of Master Hammerstein. A month ago, the old man arrived in Marburg, with his back straight, with a ring on his finger, the one Min Jae had left on the threshold a year ago. The master had found himself a partner, not a romantic one, a business partner, an old blacksmith friend from a neighboring town. They'd worked together for 40 years. They knew each other better than they knew their own wives. Min Jae had made them a ring, in silence. The master looked at him, at the workshop, at the apprentices, and said one thing: "You don't make swords." That's right. Then he left, with his back straight, with the ring, with a smirk. Min Jae thought of Seiren, of his great 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 Caught. He thought about the client from Seoul, the one who was supposed to come for an engagement ring on the very day he didn't return. The ring was still on the workbench, unpolished, in the empty workshop on the second floor above the coffee shop. Min Jae closed his eyes, opened them. He could never go back. He didn't want to. This was his world. These were his people. This was his workshop.
His hands. His rings. Evelyn stepped out into the courtyard. She walked over. She stood on the other side. She didn't lean against anything. She just stood there beside it. She said the furnace had overheated, and that if he didn't come back in 5 minutes, she wouldn't be responsible for the consequences. Min Jae said he was coming. He didn't move.
She said that wasn't a suggestion, but a statement of fact. He didn't move. She snorted. Then she moved closer. Just a little closer. Shoulder to shoulder on the other side of Rosalia. Min Jae stood between the two women and watched the sunset. At Neil, who was singing. At Lisel, who was laughing. At Clara, who was writing something in her journal. At Hayun, who had stepped out onto the porch with a cup of tea and was looking at him. From a distance, without approaching, just watching, he raised his hand. 4 rings on his fingers, silver in the sunset light. 3 bonds stretching from him to the people he loved, and 1 ring, sirens, that connected him to every ring he had ever made. 231, all across Westmar, each one like a tiny heart, beating alive. Bound to him, not by a rope, not by a chain, a silver thread that he had woven with his own hands, he thought. 3 years ago, he lay face down on the anvil and didn't know who he was. Now he knows. He is Park Min Jae, a jeweler, master of paired bonds, descendant of the sirens, and a blacksmith with skilled hands from Marburg, who doesn't make swords, who makes rings for those who love. Only for those who love. He lowered his hand, turned toward the workshop. Time to get to work. A new couple will come tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, and in a year, and in 10 years. He'll sit by the forge, ask what they dream of. Listen, remember, and weave it into the silver, because a bond isn't slavery. It's a craft, and it can be mastered. Min Jae entered the workshop. He sat down at the workbench. He picked up the pliers and began to work. Behind him, Neil sang a lullaby. Rosalie stood by the door. Evelyn lit the blowtorch. Liselle handed him the silver. Clara opened a magazine. Ha-Yoon brought tea, hot, just right. Min Jae took a sip. He looked at the silver in his hands and smiled. Let's get to work.